Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, this little channel only exists because people like you decide, quietly, it's worth a small gesture. If you subscribe, it simply starts finding its way back to you. No searching required the next time you can't sleep. A like helps too. It costs nothing and tells me these stories are worth making more of. While you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Somewhere quiet in London, maybe a house in Sydney, evening just settling in. Somewhere in California, the day finally winding down. Leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one. All right, love. Turn the lights down low or off altogether if you can manage it. Let your hands rest. Comfortable? Good. Let's go. 5:30 in the morning, and Millbrook has not yet decided to wake up. There is a particular kind of dark that settles over an English market town in the hour before dawn, a dark that is not empty so much as waiting. Somewhere down near the river, a dog barks twice, and then thinks better of it. A cartwheel creaks over cobblestones, iron-rimmed, slow, and the sound carries farther than it has any right to in the stillness. This is the milkman, and he has been awake since 4, moving between the dairy yard and the houses that will soon need him. His breath visible in the cold, his hands red from the metal of the churns. Eleanor Hartley is already awake, though she's not yet opened her eyes. She's 34 years old, the wife of a draper, and she's learned over 11 years of marriage that the moment before rising is the only truly private moment of her day. So she lies there a while longer, listening to her husband breathe beside her, to the house settling around them the way old houses do, and she lets herself simply exist for a minute or two before the day claims her. Her name is Eleanor. Her husband is Thomas Hartley, and he keeps a drapery and haberdashery shop on the high street, 3 doors down from the chemist, in a narrow building with a bow window that Thomas dresses himself every Monday morning with a care that borders on reverence. Eleanor knows this house, this street, this town, in the particular way a person knows a place they were not born into but chose, or rather married into and grew to love slowly, the way you grow to love a person you see every single day. Downstairs, in the small room off the scullery where she sleeps, Sarah is already stirring. Sarah is 17, the Hartleys' maid of all work, which is a grand way of describing a girl who does nearly everything and is paid very little for it. She rises before anyone else in the house, always, because the range must be lit, the water must be carried, and a household does not simply begin itself. I find something quietly admirable in this, the way an entire domestic world depended on one young woman being awake before the sun, so that by the time everyone else stirred, the house already felt warm and alive as if it had done so on its own. There is a sound worth pausing on here, one you would not expect. It is the sound of a lucifer match striking against the side of a small tin box, a sharp scratch followed by a hiss, and then the particular smell of sulphur that lingers for just a moment before it fades into wood smoke. Sarah crouches at the range, coaxing the coals from the night before back into something usable, feeding it kindling first, then coal, and the whole kitchen begins, slowly, to breathe warmth back into itself. Now, I want you to picture the street itself for a moment, because this is where the real texture of Victorian daily life lives, not in the grand houses, but here, in the ordinary rhythm of a town remembering how to be a town again after a night of silence. The baker 2 doors down has been at his oven since 3 in the morning. This is not an exaggeration for effect. Bread, in a town like Millbrook, needed to be ready by the time working households wanted it, which meant bakers kept hours that would exhaust most of us simply to imagine. By 5:30, the smell of baking bread has already begun to drift along the high street, mixing with wood smoke and the damp mineral smell of the cobblestones after a light overnight rain. A lamplighter moves along the far end of the street, though his work now is the opposite of what it was the evening before. He carries a long pole with a hook and a small flame at one end, and one by one he reaches up and extinguishes the gas lamps that lit the town through the night, each one going dark with a soft pop, until the street relies entirely on the slow grey light beginning to gather over the rooftops. And here is a detail that tends to surprise people. The knocker-upper has already made his rounds. This was a real occupation, and a rather wonderful one to imagine. A person paid to walk the streets before dawn with a long pole, tapping on the upstairs windows of households who could not afford, or did not yet own, an alarm clock. He would tap until he heard a voice or a knuckle against the glass in reply, and then move on to the next house, and the next, an entire town woken gently, window by window, by a stranger with excellent timing and a very long stick. Thomas Hartley wakes properly around 6, and there is a small ritual to it that Eleanor has watched play out identically for 11 years. He lies still for a moment. He exhales, long and slow, and then he says, every single morning, without fail, "Well then," as though greeting the day itself as an acquaintance he is pleased, if not thrilled, to see again. Their household this morning is not unusual for a family of their standing, which is to say, comfortably respectable rather than wealthy. There is Thomas, there is Eleanor, there is their daughter Alice, 19 years old, and recently returned from a spell working as a governess for a family 2 towns over, and there is Robert, their son, 12, who has a talent for arriving downstairs exactly 1 minute before he is required to, and somehow never being late. And there is Sarah, of course, who by 6 o'clock has the kitchen range fully alive, a kettle beginning to hum toward a boil, and the beginnings of porridge started in a pot that has clearly seen many mornings just like this one. I want to slow down here for a moment, because there is something in the ordinary architecture of this household worth noticing before we move on. A family like the Hartleys sat at a very particular point on the Victorian social ladder, a point that gets almost entirely overlooked by history, which tends to obsess over dukes and duchesses on one end and desperate poverty on the other. In between, there existed an enormous, quietly striving population of shopkeepers, clerks, tradesmen, and their families, people who owned exactly one servant, who wore their good coat to church and their working coat everywhere else, who worried about respectability the way other people worried about money, which is to say, constantly and often for the same underlying reasons. Eleanor rises finally, dresses in the cold grey light coming through the curtains, and the process itself is worth pausing on, because it is not what you might picture. She does not require Sarah's help this morning, though on days when she's dressing for church or for a call upon a neighbour, she sometimes does. This morning she manages alone, and it takes longer than you would think. There is a chemise first, plain cotton, soft from many washings, then stockings, held up with garters just above the knee, then a corset which Eleanor laces herself standing at the small mirror, reaching behind her with practised hands, pulling the laces snug but not tight, because Eleanor Hartley, unlike some of her more fashionable acquaintances, has never been one for tight lacing, finding the whole business faintly ridiculous and more than a little uncomfortable. Over this comes a chemisette, then a petticoat, then another, because volume in a skirt in this period comes from layers of fabric rather than the great steel cage of a crinoline, which by this point in the decade has largely fallen out of fashion among sensible women in towns like Millbrook. Finally the dress itself, a dark wool day gown in a deep plum colour that Eleanor chose 3 winters ago and has had altered twice since, because a good dress, properly cared for, was expected to last years, not seasons. Here is the part that always strikes me as remarkable, though it rarely gets mentioned. The buttons on the back of Eleanor's dress number perhaps 20, tiny things, and she cannot reach the top ones herself. So she leaves them for Alice, who appears in the doorway a few minutes later still in her dressing gown, hair loose down her back, and does them up with the quick, unthinking competence of a daughter who has done this for her mother 1,000 times before. "There," Alice says, patting her mother's shoulder once the last button is fastened, and then she's gone again, back to her own room, to begin the same layered process herself. Downstairs, something else is happening, something I think you will find genuinely interesting because it concerns Thomas, and it concerns the actual mechanics of how a family like this one made its living. The shop does not simply open. It is prepared, methodically, the way a stage is set before a performance, and Thomas treats this preparation with a seriousness that borders on the theatrical. He's down in the shop by 6:30, still in his shirt sleeves. His good coat hung carefully on a hook by the door, waiting for the moment he actually needs to look presentable. The shop itself smells of new cloth, a smell I find surprisingly specific once you have encountered it, something between cotton and lanolin and the faint mineral tang of dye that has not yet fully cured. Bolts of fabric line the walls, floor to ceiling, wool and cotton and a little silk for those customers who can afford it, and Thomas moves among them checking stock, running his thumb along the edge of a bolt to check it has not slipped, adjusting a ribbon display that Sarah's younger brother helped restock the evening before. The bow window is the true centrepiece of the shop, and Thomas dresses it himself every single Monday, refusing to let anyone else touch it, not even Eleanor, who has opinions about colour that Thomas privately admits are usually better than his own. This morning is not Monday, so the window remains as he left it 3 days ago, a careful arrangement of ribbons and lace, and a single length of deep blue wool draped just so, catching whatever light the grey morning is willing to offer. Here is a fact that tends to genuinely surprise people, and I want to sit with it for just a moment before we move on. A shop like Thomas Hartley's functioned as something close to a social institution for the women of the town, not merely a place of commerce. Eleanor's female acquaintances did not simply come in, purchase what they needed, and leave. They lingered. They discussed fabric the way one might discuss a piece of gossip, turning it over, holding it up to the light, debating its merits with genuine passion. A trip to the Drapers was, for many respectable women with time on their hands, one of the primary sanctioned outings of an ordinary week, a place where information travelled just as readily as ribbon. And that is our first proper glimpse of the world we're stepping into tonight. Not the world of countesses and grand estates, which you have likely heard described 100 times before, but this one, the world of the shop bell and the porridge pot and the corset laced alone in grey morning light. This is what ordinary life actually looked like for the vast, largely forgotten middle of Victorian England, and we have a great deal more of it still to explore. By 7, the whole household has gathered in the small dining room behind the shop, and breakfast, in a home like this one, follows rules so ingrained that nobody in the room would think to call them rules at all. They would simply call it breakfast. Thomas sits at the head of the table because he is the head of the household, and this is not questioned, not resented, simply accepted the way one accepts the shape of a room. Eleanor sits at the opposite end nearest the door to the kitchen, because she is the one who will need to rise first if something requires attending to. Alice and Robert sit along the sides, and there is porridge, and there is toast, and there is a pot of tea that Sarah brings through and sets before Eleanor, who pours. Here is something worth noticing, something that tells you a great deal about how a household like this actually functioned beneath its quiet surface. The pouring of tea was never a small thing. It was, in its own modest way, an act of authority. Eleanor decided who received their cup first, how strong it was poured, whether there was enough milk left for a second round. Visitors to Victorian homes across every social class understood this instinctively. The woman who poured the tea was the woman who ran the house, regardless of whose name was on the shop above. Robert eats quickly, the way 12-year-old boys have eaten breakfast in every century of recorded history, and Thomas watches him with an expression that is trying very hard to be stern and mostly failing. "Mind your pace," Thomas says, not for the first time this week. Robert slows by perhaps 10%, which both of them silently agree is close enough. The boy attends the grammar school at the far end of town, a walk of just under a mile that he makes twice daily, rain or shine, alongside 2 other boys from neighbouring streets who fall into step with him at the corner by the ironmonger's. Education for a boy of Robert's standing in this period was neither guaranteed nor free, and Thomas Hartley's willingness to pay the modest fees required to keep his son enrolled says something quiet but important about how the family understands its own place in the world and where it hopes to be standing a generation from now. Latin this morning, Robert announces to no one in particular, with the specific dread of a boy who has not finished conjugating something he was meant to conjugate the night before. Alice, across the table, does not look up from her toast, though the corner of her mouth moves in a way that suggests sympathy rather than judgment. She remembers her own schooling well enough, though it looked considerably different from her brother's. Girls of the Hartleys' standing were rarely sent to grammar schools at all, Alice was educated at home for several years by a governess shared with two other families in the street, splitting the cost between them, and later spent 18 months at a small private establishment in the county town that taught music, French, deportment, and just enough arithmetic to manage household accounts, though decidedly not enough to manage anything grander. 3. I want to pause here, because there is something worth sitting with in that last sentence, something that will matter more as we go on tonight. Alice Hartley is 19 years old, unmarried, recently returned home after 18 months spent working as a governess for a family called the Pembertons, 2 towns over, and she carries with her, quietly, a small private hope that she has not fully admitted even to herself, let alone to her mother across the breakfast table. She would like, more than she has said aloud to anyone, to continue teaching, not as a temporary arrangement before marriage, which is how her mother has quietly begun to frame the governess position in conversation with neighbours, but as something closer to a chosen path. This was, for a young woman of Alice's standing in this period, a genuinely complicated thing to want. Teaching was one of the vanishingly few occupations considered respectable for a woman of her class, which made it acceptable in theory, but it existed in an uncomfortable space, neither quite a proper career, nor merely a waiting room before marriage, and a woman who pursued it too deliberately, who seemed to prefer it to the alternative, risked being quietly discussed in exactly the tone Eleanor uses when she mentions the Pembertons now, a tone that suggests concern dressed up as pride. Alice has not told her mother that she wrote 3 weeks ago to a school in the county town inquiring about a position. She has not told anyone. The letter sits, unanswered so far, in the small writing box she keeps on the table beside her bed, and she thinks about it more often than she would ever admit. A small folded weight she carries privately through her days, present in the room even now, though nobody at this breakfast table has the slightest idea it exists. There is something I find genuinely moving about this, the way an entire private hope can sit inside a person across a breakfast table, invisible, while porridge gets eaten and tea gets poured, and a 12-year-old boy complains about Latin, the whole ordinary surface of a morning continuing on exactly as it appears to, while underneath it, someone is quietly carrying the shape of a different life they have not yet worked up the courage to want out loud. We will come back to Alice's letter. Not yet, but we will. Breakfast concludes the way it always does, with Thomas checking his pocket watch, a plain silver piece that belonged to his father, and announcing the time with the satisfaction of a man who takes genuine pleasure in punctuality. Robert is sent off with his satchel and a slightly too firm pat on the shoulder from his father. Alice begins clearing the table, a task she and Sarah share without much discussion of who does which part, simply falling into a rhythm worn smooth by repetition. And Sarah, meanwhile, has already moved on to the next item in a list that exists nowhere but in her own head, because a household of this size, with one servant managing what would, in a grander home, have been divided among 6 or 7, required a kind of relentless internal organisation that I think we genuinely undersell when we picture Victorian domestic life. Consider for a moment what Sarah's morning actually contains, laid out plainly rather than romanticised. The range needed blacking once a week, a filthy, laborious task involving a paste of graphite that had to be applied, buffed and reapplied to keep the iron from rusting. The grates needed clearing of ash daily. Water needed carrying, bucket by bucket, up from the pump in the small yard behind the house, because indoor plumbing of any reliable kind remained, for a household like this, still very much a luxury rather than an expectation. Beds needed making. Chamber pots needed emptying, a task nobody wrote poems about, but which occupied a genuinely significant portion of a housemaid's day. Floors needed sweeping, brass needed polishing, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a midday meal needed preparing for a family that expected it to appear, reliably, at the appropriate hour, as though it had assembled itself. Sarah earns, in wages, a sum that would strike most modern listeners as almost unbelievably small, alongside her board and lodging in the small room off the scullery, and yet her position, precarious and exhausting as it was, sat at a point on the social ladder that many young women in service considered genuinely fortunate, because the Hartleys, by all accounts among their neighbours, were considered decent employers. Eleanor did not shout. Thomas did not interfere in the kitchen. Sarah was permitted one afternoon off a fortnight, and on Sundays after church she was allowed to walk out with a young man named Peter who worked at the tannery on the edge of town, an arrangement that Eleanor knows about and has chosen, quietly, not to comment on, beyond making certain Sarah is always home well before dark. I find something worth noticing in that small act of discretion. The way Eleanor extends to Sarah exactly the kind of quiet privacy she herself would want extended to her, without ever framing it as generosity, simply as the ordinary decency of one woman toward another, regardless of the very real gulf in status that sits between them and that neither would ever pretend was not there. By 8 o'clock, the shop bell above Thomas Hartley's door gives its first ring of the day, a bright, slightly tinny sound that will repeat on and off for the next 11 hours, marking the arrival and departure of the customers who form the true, largely invisible backbone of the family's entire livelihood. The first customer this morning is a Mrs. Ainsworth, the vicar's wife, who requires 2 yards of black ribbon for a bonnet she is retrimming, and who spends nearly 20 minutes deciding between 2 shades that, to any untrained eye, look almost identical. Thomas does not hurry her. This, I think, is worth pausing on, because it tells you something true about the entire economy of small shops like his. Patience was not simply good manners, it was the product itself, every bit as much as the ribbon. Beyond the bow window, the high street has fully woken now, and if we step outside for just a moment, there is a great deal worth seeing. The greengrocer 2 doors down has his produce arranged in wooden crates along the pavement, cabbages and turnips, and, depending on the season, apples still faintly dusted with the straw they were packed in to survive the journey from whichever orchard supplied him. The butcher across the street has joints of meat hanging visibly in his window, a practice that would horrify a modern health inspector and that no one in Millbrook in this decade thinks twice about, because this is simply how meat has always been displayed and sold, and the idea that it might be otherwise has not yet occurred to anyone. A costermonger, one of the itinerant street sellers who moved between towns and villages with a barrow of whatever was seasonal and available, has set up near the market cross this morning with a load of watercress, and his cry carries down the street in the particular sing-song rhythm that these calls always took, a rhythm that had almost nothing to do with the words themselves, and everything to do with being heard over the general noise of a working street. Here is a detail I think you will genuinely enjoy. The postman makes his first delivery of the day around this hour, and in a town the size of Millbrook, he does not simply drop letters through doors. He often knows, by name, whose correspondence is whose, and a personal letter arriving at an unexpected hour, or from an unfamiliar hand, could become a small piece of local curiosity before the recipient had even opened it. Privacy, in a town this size, was a genuinely negotiated thing, present in the details that mattered and largely absent everywhere else. It is into this street, this particular morning, that we should notice something small and easy to miss. The postman pauses outside the Hartleys shop, checks the letter in his hand against the number painted above the door, and steps inside. "Post for the household," he says, setting a small collection of envelopes on the counter beside Thomas, who is still occupied with Mrs. Ainsworth's ribbon. Alice, who has come through from the back room to fetch something entirely unrelated, sees the little pile of post and feels her pulse do something it has no business doing over an ordinary stack of letters. She does not go through them. That would be improper, and beyond that, entirely unlike her. She simply notices them, the way you notice a door that might eventually open. We will leave her there for now, this small private moment of noticing, and turn our attention elsewhere, because there is a great deal more of this town still worth exploring before the morning is through. Consider, for instance, the sheer mechanical complexity of simply keeping a household fed in this period, a complexity that gets almost entirely lost in how casually we now speak about Victorian meals. There was no refrigeration in the modern sense, which meant food shopping happened in small quantities, frequently, often daily for anything perishable. Eleanor, or more often Sarah on her behalf, would make at least 1 trip to the market most mornings, sometimes 2, because meat purchased on Monday had little hope of remaining safely edible by Thursday, and milk delivered at dawn needed using well before the day was out. This shaped the entire rhythm of a woman's domestic life in ways that are easy to overlook now, when a single weekly trip to a supermarket handles what once required daily attention, daily negotiation, daily small decisions about what was fresh, what was reasonably priced, and what could be persuaded into a meal that would satisfy a hungry husband and a growing son without straining a household budget that, for a family like the Hartleys, was comfortable but by no means limitless. There is a particular kind of quiet competence involved in this that I think deserves more credit than it generally receives. Eleanor could, without consulting a single written note, tell you the current price of a pound of butter, how it compared to last week, whether the cheesemonger's stock had improved or declined in quality, and which of the two bakers in town produced a loaf that held together properly for a full week without turning stale by Thursday. This was not trivial knowledge. It was, in its own unglamorous way, a genuine expertise built through years of daily practice and largely invisible to anyone who did not share the burden of producing it. Let us walk a little further down the high street, past the ironmonger's, where a boy of perhaps 14 is sweeping the step and arranging a display of tin pails in the window, past the chemist, where a customer is waiting for a prescription to be made up by hand, the chemist himself grinding something in a small marble mortar behind the counter, the sharp medicinal smell of it drifting faintly out onto the pavement. There is a bank at the corner, a solid stone building that projects a kind of institutional calm entirely deliberate in its architecture, and beside it a small office belonging to a solicitor, where a clerk can be seen through the window, seated at a high desk, copying something out in a careful, practiced hand, because in a world before typewriters had become commonplace in offices of this size, legal and business correspondence still depended almost entirely on the patient labour of men whose entire working lives were built around penmanship. And there, at the far end of the street, is the church, its spire visible from nearly anywhere in town, a landmark both literal and social, because in a place like Millbrook, one's relationship to that building, which pew one occupied, how regularly one attended, how one dressed for the occasion, said almost as much about a family's standing as their income did. We will return to the church later tonight, because Sunday, in a household like the Hartleys, is its own particular world, worth exploring slowly and properly in its own time. For now, though, let us go back inside the shop, because Mrs. Ainsworth has finally settled on her ribbon, and the bell above the door is about to ring again. Robert, meanwhile, has reached the grammar school, a squat stone building with tall narrow windows that always seem, no matter the season, to admit precisely enough light to read by and not a fraction more. Victorian grammar schools of this kind occupied an interesting middle position in the wider educational landscape, more accessible than the great public schools that educated the sons of the aristocracy, and considerably more rigorous than the elementary schools that had only recently become available to working-class children following legislation earlier in the decade, requiring some basic provision for their education. Robert's schooling costs his father a modest but real fee each term, and both Thomas and Eleanor consider it money well spent, an investment less in Robert's happiness, which frankly does not factor into the calculation nearly as much as it might today, and more in his eventual prospects. The curriculum leans heavily on Latin, as Robert's grumbling at breakfast already suggested, along with English composition, arithmetic, a little geography, and for the older boys, the beginnings of Greek. Discipline is strict by any modern measure, and a cane sits in plain view on the master's desk, though I want to be careful here not to dwell on this longer than it deserves, because it was simply an accepted feature of the educational landscape of the period, unremarkable to everyone involved, rather than the alarming exception it would represent today. What strikes me more, honestly, is the sheer physical endurance the whole system demanded of boys this age. Robert will sit largely still on a hard wooden bench for the better part of 6 hours today, broken only by a short midday period, in a room heated, in winter, by a single stove that warms perhaps the front third of the space effectively, and leaves the back rows in a kind of dedicated, character-building cold. Let us leave Robert to his conjugations for now, and turn back toward the shop, because there is something happening there worth our attention. The mid-morning period in a shop like Thomas Hartley's tends to bring a particular kind of customer, a category worth understanding because it tells you something true about how Victorian retail actually functioned as a social institution rather than a purely commercial one. These are the women who have finished their own household's morning tasks and have a little time before the demands of the afternoon begin, and a visit to the drapers, for many of them, serves a purpose only loosely related to actual purchasing. They come to look. They come to hear what has arrived from the wholesalers in the county town. They come, frankly, to see one another, because a respectable woman in Millbrook had a genuinely limited number of places she could appear in public without occasioning comment, and a shop counter, with its legitimate commercial purpose, offered a kind of safe harbour for exactly the sort of extended, wandering conversation that would look idle anywhere else. This morning brings Mrs. Fenwick, the wife of the town's principal solicitor, and a standing that sits noticeably above the Hartleys' own, a fact that Eleanor, who has come through to help Thomas manage the small rush, is perfectly conscious of without ever once letting it show in her manner. Mrs. Fenwick requires nothing in particular, which is in itself entirely typical, and spends a pleasant quarter hour examining a new consignment of printed cotton that arrived from the county town only 2 days prior, holding lengths of it up against the light from the window, asking Eleanor's opinion with a warmth that feels genuine, because it largely is, even as both women understand, without ever discussing it, precisely where they each stand relative to the other. I find something worth noticing in this dynamic, something that Victorian etiquette manuals of the period spent an extraordinary amount of ink attempting to codify, and that real life, as always, handled with far more nuance than any manual could capture. Mrs. Fenwick and Eleanor Hartley are not equals, not in the strict social calculus of the period, and yet their exchange this morning carries a genuine warmth that owes nothing to obligation and everything to two women who have known each other 12 years and have, somewhere along the way, become something close to friends, regardless of what their husbands' respective professions might suggest about the propriety of the association. Class in Victorian England, particularly at this middling level, was rarely as rigid in daily practice as it appears in retrospect. It was a set of understood positions, yes, observed carefully in matters of precedence and address, but lived within by actual people who often liked one another, worried about one another's children, and shared the small daily texture of a town too modest in size to support the kind of strict social segregation available in a city. Mrs. Fenwick eventually purchases 3 yards of the printed cotton, more out of genuine appreciation for the pattern than any particular need, and departs with a promise to call on Eleanor properly later in the week, an invitation both women understand to be entirely sincere. The shop settles briefly into a quieter stretch, and Thomas takes the opportunity to step into the back room for a cup of tea that Sarah has left warming, and it is here, in this small, unremarkable lull, that I want to slow down and tell you something about Thomas Hartley himself, because we have spent a good deal of time in his shop tonight without truly meeting the man who built it. Thomas is 41, the son of a farm labourer from a village some 15 miles distant, and simply owning his own shop, employing a servant, and affording grammar school fees for his son represents, in the quiet arithmetic of Victorian social mobility, a genuinely significant rise from where his own life began. He apprenticed as a young man to a draper in the county town, 7 years of long hours and low pay, in exchange for a trade that, once mastered, offered him a path his own father never had access to. He does not speak of this often, and when he does, it is with a kind of understated pride that never quite tips over into boasting, because boasting, in Thomas's understanding of the world, was neither dignified nor particularly wise. But it sits underneath everything he does in that shop, every careful arrangement of the window, every patient hour spent with a customer like Mrs. Ainsworth deliberating over ribbon. This shop is not simply a livelihood. It is proof, tangible and daily renewed, that a life could be built rather than merely inherited, and I think there is something genuinely moving in that, once you notice it sitting quietly beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. By midday the rhythm of the household shifts again, the way it does every day at roughly this hour, and I think it is worth pausing to notice how many small shifts an ordinary Victorian day actually contained, each one governed by its own particular set of expectations. Dinner, in a household like the Hartleys, was taken at midday rather than in the evening, a habit that persisted among tradesmen's families even as the fashionable classes had begun shifting their principal meal later into the evening, a change driven largely by the demands of a social calendar built around calling hours and evening entertainments that simply did not apply to a family whose day revolved around a shop that needed tending until early evening. Sarah has been at work in the kitchen since shortly after 11, and the meal she produces when Thomas closes the shop briefly at 1 o'clock and the family gathers again around the same table they left after breakfast is modest but genuinely substantial. A joint of mutton, purchased 2 days prior and stretched carefully across several meals in the manner every competent Victorian household cook understood instinctively. Potatoes, a dish of seasonal vegetables, bread, always bread, cut thick and spread with butter that Eleanor purchases from a farm just outside town, a woman named Mrs. Coates who brings it in twice weekly along with fresh eggs, wrapped carefully in cloth against the journey. There is a particular quality to a midday meal eaten together like this, unhurried despite the shop waiting, that I find genuinely appealing to imagine. Thomas asks Robert about his morning, receives a mostly honest account of the Latin lesson, and offers the kind of gentle, slightly distracted encouragement fathers of this era generally offered, present but not overly involved in the granular detail of a child's schooling, which was understood to be largely the province of the school itself rather than the home. Alice eats quietly, her mind still partly occupied with a small stack of letters that arrived that morning, none of which, as it turns out, was the one she has been waiting for. She noticed this the moment Thomas mentioned the post in passing, a small private disappointment she absorbs without any outward sign of it, the way a person learns to absorb the ordinary disappointments of an ordinary Tuesday. After the meal, the household divides again, each person returning to their particular occupation. Thomas back to the shop, Robert back to school for the afternoon session, Sarah to the accumulating tasks of washing up and beginning preparations for the evening meal, and Eleanor and Alice settle, as they do most afternoons that do not require calls or errands, into the small parlour at the back of the house where the light is good in the early afternoon for the particular occupation that filled an enormous, largely unremarked portion of respectable Victorian women's daily lives: needlework. I want to slow down here because I think we tend to picture Victorian needlework as a kind of decorative hobby, a pleasant way to pass idle hours, and that picture, while not entirely wrong, misses something important about what the activity actually represented in a household like this one. Some of what Eleanor and Alice produce this afternoon is genuinely practical. A torn hem on one of Robert's school shirts needs mending. A set of pillowcases requires new edging. Stockings, worn thin at the heel through weeks of walking, need careful darning, a skill that Eleanor performs with an almost unconscious efficiency, her needle moving in the small cross-hatched pattern that turns a hole into something structurally sound again, if not invisible. But alongside this practical mending, there is also, this particular afternoon, a piece of ornamental work that Alice has been slowly building for several weeks, a set of embroidered initials intended for a set of linen that will eventually form part of whatever household she someday establishes for herself, whether through marriage or, though she has not said this aloud, through some other arrangement entirely. This kind of work, the slow accumulation of embroidered linens and worked samplers, carried a real social weight in this period that is easy to lose sight of now. It signalled patience, diligence, taste, all qualities considered genuinely important in assessing a young woman's suitability, and Alice, sitting in the afternoon light with her needle moving steadily through pale linen, understands this even as her private thoughts drift somewhere else entirely, toward that unanswered letter, toward a version of her future that has very little to do with linens embroidered in anticipation of a husband she has not yet met, and, if she is honest with herself in the quiet of this particular afternoon, is not entirely certain she wants to meet at all. Eleanor notices something in her daughter's silence, the particular quality of it, distracted in a way that is not quite Alice's usual distraction, and she considers asking about it directly, the way a mother might. But she does not yet, choosing instead to let the silence sit, trusting, in the manner of a woman who has raised a daughter she genuinely respects, that Alice will speak when she is ready to, and not before. There is something in that small act of restraint worth noticing, I think, a kind of quiet trust that does not always get credited to Victorian mothers in the popular imagination, which tends to picture the era's parenting as uniformly strict and unyielding. Eleanor's own mother was considerably less patient with her, and Eleanor has spent a good portion of her adult life deciding, quietly and without ever announcing it as a philosophy, to raise her own daughter differently. The afternoon continues in this manner for some while. Needle and thread, the soft particular sound of fabric moving through fingers, the occasional creak of the house settling, until Eleanor sets her own work down and announces that she intends to call on Mrs. Fenwick as promised, and asks whether Alice would care to accompany her. Alice agrees, glad, if she is honest, of the interruption, of anything that will pull her thoughts away from the letterbox for an hour or two, and the two women begin the small familiar ritual of preparing to go out, which in this period involved rather more consideration than simply putting on a coat. Calling, in Victorian England, operated according to a set of rules so specific that entire chapters of etiquette manuals were devoted to nothing else. And while Eleanor Hartley would never describe herself as someone who studied such things closely, she carries the rules within her nonetheless, absorbed over years of practice until they feel less like rules and more like simple good sense. One did not call before 11 in the morning, nor generally after 5 in the afternoon, unless the visit had been specifically invited outside those hours. A first call was, in theory, meant to be brief, no longer than perhaps 20 minutes, though in practice this rule bent considerably once genuine friendship had established itself, as it long ago had between Eleanor and Mrs. Fenwick. One brought calling cards, small printed rectangles that served a purpose considerably more complex than simply announcing a name, functioning as a kind of social currency, exchanged, left, sometimes turned down at one corner to indicate a call made in person rather than sent by servant, a whole silent language conducted in cardboard that most participants understood instinctively and outsiders found, quite reasonably, baffling. Eleanor and Alice walk the short distance to the Fenwicks' house, a solid brick building set slightly back from the street, with a small front garden that Mrs. Fenwick tends herself, a fact she mentions often, with the particular pride of a woman who could easily afford a gardener and has chosen, deliberately, not to hire one. The visit itself unfolds much as such visits always did. Tea brought in by the Fenwicks' housemaid, conversation ranging pleasantly across the small currency of local news, who has taken ill, whose daughter has become engaged, what the vicar said in his sermon the previous Sunday that half the congregation is apparently still discussing. There is nothing dramatic in any of it, and I think that is rather the point. This was the actual texture of a woman's social world in a town like Millbrook, built not from grand events, but from this steady accumulation of small exchanges, each one reinforcing the web of relationships that held the whole community together in ways that were largely invisible until you stopped to look closely at them. Mrs. Fenwick, midway through the visit, mentions almost in passing that her niece, visiting from London, has brought with her a fashion periodical containing illustrations of the very latest styles, and offers to show it to Eleanor and Alice before they leave. This small offer produces a genuine flicker of interest in Alice, who has, whatever else occupies her private thoughts this particular week, the entirely ordinary interest of any 19-year-old in what the fashionable world, several counties away, considers current. The periodical, when it appears, reveals illustrations of dresses considerably more elaborate than anything practical for daily life in Millbrook, and the three women spend a genuinely pleasant quarter-hour examining them, Mrs. Fenwick offering opinions with the confidence of a woman whose husband's income permits at least occasional indulgence in such things, Eleanor more measured, noting which elements might reasonably be adapted to a simpler dress without requiring an entirely new wardrobe, and Alice mostly quiet, absorbing the details the way young women of every era have absorbed fashion, filing away small particulars, a sleeve shape here, a trim detail there, that might someday find their way into something she actually owns. I find something worth noting in this small domestic scene, something that speaks to a broader truth about how fashion actually functioned outside London and the other great fashionable centres of the period. The gap between what appeared in periodicals and what most women actually wore was considerable, and largely accepted as simply the nature of things. Women like Eleanor and Alice did not attempt to replicate high fashion exactly. They borrowed selectively, adapted thoughtfully, and produced something that acknowledged current style without pretending to a wealth or social position they did not possess. There was no shame in this. It was simply how the great majority of English women actually dressed. The visit concludes a little before 4, with promises exchanged to meet again soon, and Eleanor and Alice make their way back toward the high street, the afternoon light beginning its slow autumn slide toward evening. It is on this walk home that Alice finally says something. "Mother," she begins, and then stops, the way a person stops when the thing they intend to say suddenly feels considerably larger once spoken aloud than it did in the privacy of their own thoughts. Eleanor, who has been half expecting some version of this conversation for several days now without knowing precisely what shape it would take, simply waits, matching her pace to her daughter's, saying nothing that might close the small opening Alice has just created. "I wrote to a school," Alice says finally, "in the county town, about a teaching position." There is a pause here that I think is worth letting sit exactly as long as it sits between them, because Eleanor's silence in this moment is not disapproval, though Alice, watching her mother's face carefully, cannot yet be entirely certain of that. Eleanor is quiet for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in the context of a conversation like this one, and then she says, simply, "And did they reply?" "Not yet," Alice says. "Well," Eleanor says, and there is something in her tone that Alice will spend the rest of the walk turning over, trying to identify, something that is not quite approval, and not quite worry, but some third thing sitting between them. Well then, we shall simply have to wait and see what they say. It is not everything Alice hoped for. It is also considerably more than she feared, and the two of them walk the rest of the way home in a silence that feels, for the first time in several days, genuinely comfortable rather than heavy with something unspoken. We will come back to this letter again before the night is through. For now, though, let us turn our attention elsewhere, because the afternoon is drawing toward its close, and there is a great deal of Millbrook still waiting to settle into evening. I promised we would return to the church, and this feels like the right moment, because as Eleanor and Alice make their way back along the high street, its spire rises ahead of them, and it is worth pausing to properly understand what that building actually meant to a town like Millbrook, beyond the obvious matter of religious observance. Sunday, in a household like the Hartleys, organized the entire week around it, not simply as a day of rest, but as a kind of social performance, though I use that word carefully, because performance suggests insincerity, and there was nothing insincere in the Hartleys' faith. Rather, Sunday worship functioned simultaneously as genuine spiritual practice and as the single clearest weekly demonstration of a family's respectability, and these two functions were never experienced as being in tension with one another. They were simply, for most people in this period, the same thing. The Hartleys occupy a pew roughly 2/3 of the way back in the parish church, a position that tells anyone paying attention, and in a town this size, everyone was paying attention, exactly where the family sits in the town's social hierarchy. The Fenwicks sit considerably closer to the front. The farm labourers and their families, on the rare occasions they attended the parish church rather than one of the smaller nonconformist chapels that served much of the working population, occupied the very back rows, or in some parishes, a gallery set aside specifically for them, a physical arrangement of the congregation that mapped the town's social order onto its sacred space with an honesty that would strike most of us today as remarkably blunt. The sermon itself, delivered by a vicar named Mr. Ainsworth, husband of the ribbon-deliberating Mrs. Ainsworth we met earlier this morning, tends toward the practical rather than the fiery, a steady diet of moral instruction delivered in the measured, slightly formal cadence that congregations of this period expected and largely preferred, having little patience for anything that smacked of enthusiasm or excessive emotional display, qualities associated, in the popular imagination of respectable churchgoers, with the nonconformist chapels rather than the established church. But church, on any given Sunday, was never simply about the hour spent inside the building. It was about the gathering before the service, in small clusters on the church path, exchanging news. It was about the walk home afterward, often taken slowly and by a slightly longer route than strictly necessary, precisely because it offered an opportunity for exactly the kind of unhurried conversation that a working week rarely permitted. It was, in the fullest sense, the primary mechanism through which an entire community maintained itself, week after week, generation after generation, long before anyone had reason to think about community in such deliberate terms. Neighbours, too, played a role in daily life considerably more significant than the word suggests to modern ears. The Hartleys' immediate neighbour on one side, a widow named Mrs. Prentice who occupies the house above a small stationer's shop, has lived beside the family for 9 years, and the relationship between the two households, while never especially intimate, operates according to a set of quiet mutual obligations that neither party would think to describe as remarkable, simply as the ordinary business of living close to another family. Mrs. Prentice keeps an eye on the Hartleys' house when the family attends church together, a small unspoken arrangement that requires no discussion, simply an understanding built over years of proximity. When Robert was younger and prone to a rather alarming fever one particularly difficult winter, it was Mrs. Prentice who sat with him for an afternoon while Eleanor fetched the doctor. An act of ordinary neighbourly kindness that Eleanor has never forgotten, and that shapes quietly the warmth with which she still greets the older woman every time their paths cross on the street. This kind of dense, overlapping neighbourly obligation was, I think, one of the genuine comforts of small-town Victorian life, even as it came bundled with a corresponding lack of privacy that could feel at times considerably less comfortable. Everyone in Millbrook knew a great deal about everyone else's business, not through any particular malice, simply through the accumulated weight of daily proximity, and a family's reputation, once established, tended to follow it with a persistence that modern city dwellers, accustomed to the relative anonymity of larger populations, would likely find difficult to fully imagine. By the time Eleanor and Alice reach home, the light has shifted properly into late afternoon, that particular quality of gold that autumn light takes on in England in the hour or two before it begins its final slide toward dusk, and the high street has settled into its own late afternoon rhythm, quieter than the morning rush, the greengrocer beginning to bring in his crates for the evening, a few children released from the elementary school at the far end of town making their way home in loose, noisy clusters, satchels swinging. Thomas's shop bell rings one final significant time before closing, a customer requiring a length of black crepe, a request that in this period needed no explanation, crepe being the fabric of mourning, and everyone in Millbrook understood without needing to be told that a household somewhere in town had recently experienced a loss and was beginning the long, carefully regulated process of dressing itself in grief according to rules every bit as codified as those governing calling cards and church pews. Thomas handles the transaction with a particular gentleness that Eleanor, watching from the doorway between the shop and the house, has always found quietly moving, a businessman's transaction conducted with the tenderness the moment actually requires, and I think there is something worth noticing in that too, the way even the most ordinary commercial exchanges in a town this size carried within them an awareness of the actual human circumstances behind them, rather than the anonymous efficiency we have grown accustomed to in our own commercial lives. The shop closes at 7, and Thomas goes through the same small ritual he performs every evening, checking the till, noting the day's takings in a ledger he keeps with the same careful precision he brings to everything else, drawing the shutters across the bow window, turning the key in the lock with a particular satisfaction that never seems to diminish, however many thousands of times he has performed this exact motion. Robert arrives home shortly after, released from the school's afternoon session, his satchel considerably lighter than it was at dawn, having deposited its contents onto whatever unfortunate desk received his attention through the long middle hours of the day, and he comes through the door with the specific hunger of a 12-year-old boy who has, in his own estimation, not eaten anything at all since breakfast, despite substantial evidence to the contrary at midday. Sarah, meanwhile, has spent the later afternoon hours preparing the evening meal, a lighter affair than the midday dinner, given that dinner remains the day's principal meal in this household, but a proper meal nonetheless, bread and cheese, perhaps a little cold meat left from the joint, and tea, always tea, brewed strong enough that Thomas jokes most evenings that a spoon might reasonably be expected to stand upright in it. There is something worth noting about the evening meal in a household like this one, something that distinguishes it clearly from what we might now think of as dinner. This was not an elaborate occasion. It required little of Sarah beyond what she had already prepared earlier in the day, and the family gathered around the table with the particular ease of people at the close of a long day, conversation looser, less structured than the more formal exchanges of the midday meal, Robert recounting some incident from the schoolyard with the exaggerated drama only a 12-year-old can bring to an entirely unremarkable dispute over a lost pencil, Thomas listening with the specific half-attention of a man still mentally tallying the day's shop receipts, Eleanor watching her family with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has, whatever small private worries occupy the edges of her thoughts, built exactly the household she set out, all those years ago, to build. After the meal, the household settles into what was, for a family of this standing, the genuine heart of the day, the evening hours before bed. And I think this is worth exploring properly, because our modern imagination of Victorian evenings tends toward the grand, the candlelit ballroom, the elaborate dinner party, when the actual lived experience of most ordinary Victorian families looked considerably smaller and considerably warmer than that picture suggests. The parlour, by 7:30, has become the gathering point for the whole family. Lit by a paraffin lamp on the central table, its warm circle of light drawing everyone toward it the way lamplight has drawn families together for centuries, before and since. Thomas settles into his particular chair, the one nearest the fire, with the newspaper he purchased that morning and has not yet had a moment to properly read, working through it now with the slow, thorough attention of a man who considers himself reasonably well informed about matters beyond Millbrook's High Street and intends to remain that way. Eleanor takes up her needlework again, the same mending that occupied her afternoon, because a household supply of things requiring repair was never, in this period, something one simply finished, only something one kept pace with, more or less successfully, week after week. Alice, beside her mother, has brought out a book, a novel borrowed from a small subscription library that operates out of the back room of the stationer's shop below Mrs. Prentice's rooms, a service that, for a modest annual fee, allowed families like the Hartleys access to considerably more reading material than they could otherwise have afforded to purchase outright. And here is a detail I find genuinely lovely, one that speaks to something real about how Victorian families of this kind actually spent their evenings together. Reading in a household like this was rarely a purely solitary activity. Perhaps twice a week, Alice or Thomas would read aloud from whatever novel currently occupied the family's attention, the others listening as they continued their own quiet occupations, needlework, or in Robert's case, a game of some sort, played largely by himself on the hearthrug, and this shared listening created a kind of communal experience of story that I think we have largely lost in our own more solitary approach to reading. This particular evening, it is Alice's turn, and she reads a chapter from a novel currently enjoying considerable popularity, her voice settling into the particular rhythm of a person accustomed to reading aloud, pausing at the right moments, giving just enough weight to dialogue without tipping into outright performance. Robert, despite himself, stops fidgeting with his hearthrug game and listens properly once the chapter reaches a passage involving a shipwreck, because a 12-year-old boy, whatever century he happens to live in, will always find a shipwreck more compelling than whatever domestic drama occupies the surrounding chapters. Thomas lowers his newspaper partway through and simply listens, his expression settling into something unguarded, in a way it rarely is during the working hours of his day, and Eleanor's needle slows without quite stopping, her attention drifting between the fabric in her hands and her daughter's voice, and the particular contentment of a room holding her entire family safely within it. I want to sit with this scene a moment longer, because I think it captures something true about ordinary Victorian domestic happiness that tends to get lost beneath the grander, more dramatic pictures of the era we usually encounter. There is no wealth on display here, no great occasion being marked, simply a family gathered in lamplight, sharing a story, each of them occupied with their own small task and entirely, quietly content in one another's company. This, more than any ballroom or great country house, was the actual texture of most English evenings in this period, and I find something worth genuinely admiring in how little it required and how much it clearly gave back. Not every evening in the Hartley household followed this exact pattern, And it is worth spending a little time on the variations, because Victorian domestic leisure, contrary to its rather staid reputation, contained a genuine variety of small pleasures that families like this one moved between according to mood, season, and simple preference. On Wednesday evenings, more often than not, the small upright piano that occupies one corner of the parlour comes into use, an instrument that Eleanor's own mother purchased second-hand many years ago, and that made the journey to Millbrook as part of Eleanor's modest dowry when she married Thomas, carried by cart over roads that, in that particular winter, were apparently in a condition Eleanor still describes, decades later, with a kind of weary amusement. Alice plays reasonably well, the product of those 18 months at the private establishment in the county town, where music formed a central part of the curriculum considered appropriate for a young woman of her standing, and on these evenings the family gathers around the instrument in the manner families of this period frequently did, Alice working through a modest repertoire of popular songs and simple arrangements of well-known melodies, Thomas occasionally attempting to join in on the chorus of something he half remembers from his own younger days, his singing voice considerably more enthusiastic than accurate, a fact the entire family finds privately delightful rather than embarrassing. There is something genuinely worth noting about the role music played in a household like this one, something that goes beyond simple entertainment. A piano in the parlour functioned as a small but real marker of respectability, evidence that a family possessed both the means and the inclination toward what the period considered a genuinely refining accomplishment, and Alice's ability to play competently represented, in its own quiet way, a piece of social capital every bit as real as the shop downstairs, even if nobody in the family would ever describe it in such calculating terms. Card games occupy other evenings, simple ones mostly. Nothing that would raise concerns about gambling in a household that took a fairly serious view of such matters, and Robert, whatever his complaints about Latin, brings a genuine competitive intensity to even the most trivial game that never fails to amuse his parents, who have long since stopped trying to let him win and simply enjoy watching him occasionally lose with theatrical, good-natured devastation. And then there are the quieter evenings, like tonight's, built around reading or simply conversation, or on the rare occasions when the whole family feels the particular restlessness that sometimes settles over a household after a full day. Nothing more structured than sitting together in the lamplight, each occupied with their own small task, content simply to share the same warm room, rather than requiring any particular activity to justify the closeness. I find something worth genuinely admiring in the sheer modesty of these pleasures, and in how completely they seem to have satisfied the people enjoying them. There is no sense, watching this family across any given evening, of anyone waiting for something grander to arrive. The evening itself, however ordinary its contents, was the thing being enjoyed, and I think there is a lesson buried somewhere in that, one that feels, if I am honest, rather relevant to how we live now, in a world that offers considerably more in the way of entertainment, and somehow, so often, considerably less in the way of this exact quality of contentment. While the family occupies the parlour, Sarah's evening follows its own, considerably less leisurely course. There is washing up from the evening meal, always, and beyond that, the beginning of preparations for the following day. Bread that needs setting to rise if tomorrow is a baking day, which in the Hartley household falls twice weekly, vegetables that want preparing ahead for the next day's dinner, a fire that needs banking properly for the night, a task requiring real skill, since a fire banked incorrectly might either die out entirely by morning, requiring the whole laborious relighting process Sarah performs at dawn, or burn through its fuel too quickly, wasting coal that cost real money in a household watching its expenses with the particular care of a family still, in its own quiet way, climbing. Sarah's evening does contain its own small pleasures, though they look considerably different from the family's parlour entertainments. Perhaps twice a week, once her duties are largely complete, she has an hour to herself in the small room off the scullery, and on these evenings she sometimes writes to her mother, who lives in a village some distance away, and whom Sarah sees perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, letters that Sarah composes slowly, in the careful, somewhat laboured hand of a girl whose own schooling was brief and basic, covering perhaps a page and a half with news that would strike an outsider as almost entirely unremarkable, and that carries, for both Sarah and her mother, a warmth considerably larger than its actual content. On Sunday evenings, following her walk with Peter after church, Sarah's mood tends to carry a particular lightness that Eleanor has noticed without ever commenting on directly, respecting, as she does in most matters concerning her young servant, the quiet dignity of a private life that, however constrained by circumstance, belongs entirely to Sarah herself and to no one else in this house, however much affection and responsibility Eleanor genuinely feels toward the girl. By 9 o'clock, Sarah's work for the day is substantially complete, and she retires to her small room, a space perhaps 8 feet by 10, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small trunk holding everything she owns in the world, a modest inventory that would strike most of us today as almost impossibly sparse, and that Sarah herself, having known nothing else, regards without any particular sense of deprivation, simply as the ordinary shape of her life. Upstairs, the household's bedtime ritual unfolds, with the same quiet regularity that has governed every other hour of this day. Robert goes up first, not entirely willingly, though the protest he offers is more habitual than genuine, the small ceremonial complaint of a boy who feels obligated to register his objection to bedtime without actually possessing the energy to sustain a real argument about it. Eleanor follows him up to see that he washes properly, a task performed with a basin of water Sarah left warming near the kitchen range earlier and carried up in a jug, since hot water on demand, in a household of this kind, required someone to have anticipated the need well in advance, rather than simply turning a tap. There is a particular smell to a Victorian bedroom at this hour that I think deserves mentioning, something that no modern bedroom quite replicates. The faint sweetness of tallow or paraffin from the candle or small lamp lighting the room, the cooler mineral smell of the washing water. Beneath it all, the specific scent of the house itself, wood and coal smoke, and, this time of year, a faint trace of the lavender Eleanor keeps folded among the linens in the great oak press on the landing, a habit passed down from her own mother, who believed, with the quiet conviction of a woman who had never questioned it, that lavender kept moths away and improved the temper of anyone who slept beneath sheets that carried its scent. Robert says his prayers kneeling beside his bed, a nightly practice that in this household carries genuine sincerity rather than mere formality. Eleanor listening from the doorway with the particular attention of a mother who has performed this same small ritual with her son every night of his life, and has not yet, despite its familiarity, grown tired of it. Alice retires perhaps half an hour later, after a final quiet exchange with her mother in the hallway. Nothing dramatic, simply the small tender business of two women who have spent the whole day circling, gently, around a subject neither has fully resolved, finding, in this last exchange before sleep, a moment of genuine closeness that neither of them quite has words for. "I do hope they write soon," Eleanor says finally, and Alice understands, hearing it, that her mother is not merely being polite. There is real warmth in the sentence, and something that might, if Alice listens closely enough, be something close to pride. "Thank you, Mother," Alice says, and the two words carry considerably more weight than their simplicity suggests. Alice's own room is small, tidy, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk beneath the window where the unanswered letter still waits in its box, and a chest holding the slowly accumulating linen she has been working on all these weeks, the initials worked in careful, even stitches that catch the last of the candlelight before she finally blows it out. She lies awake a little longer than usual tonight, listening to the house settle around her, the particular creaks and small sounds a building makes as it cools through the evening, and allows herself, for just a few minutes before sleep finally claims her, to imagine what it might feel like to open a letter that says yes. Thomas and Eleanor retire last, as they always do, and their own nightly routine carries the easy, wordless efficiency of two people who have shared a bed for 11 years and require very little conversation to coordinate the small mechanics of preparing for sleep. Thomas winds his pocket watch, a task he performs every single night without exception, setting it on the small table beside the bed where it will tick quietly through the hours until morning. Eleanor takes down her hair, brushing it out with the same steady, unhurried strokes she has used every night since girlhood, a small private ritual that belongs entirely to this last quiet hour of the day. There is a moment, just before the candle goes out, where Thomas reaches over and takes his wife's hand, a small gesture requiring no words, and Eleanor understands it exactly as it is intended, an acknowledgement of an ordinary day well spent, a household properly cared for, a family gathered safely under one roof for one more night, and then the candle is out, and the house, room by room, floor by floor, settles into the particular silence of a small English town at night, a silence that is never quite complete, the occasional distant bark of a dog, the creak of the building cooling, somewhere far off the sound of a night watchman calling the hour in a voice that carries strangely far in the still night air, and beneath all of it, the steady, patient rhythm of a family and a household and a whole small town, breathing quietly through the dark, waiting, as it always does, for morning. Let the days move a little quicker now, the way they do in memory, one folding gently into the next, because there is a great deal more of this world still worth exploring, and not all of it fits neatly into a single Tuesday. Monday, in the Hartley household, as in nearly every household in England regardless of standing, belonged to washing, and I want to spend some real time here, because laundry day represented, without much exaggeration, the single most physically demanding day in the entire domestic calendar, a fact that modern life, with its quiet, unremarkable washing machines humming away in a corner of the kitchen, has made almost impossible to properly appreciate. Sarah begins before dawn, earlier even than her usual rising, because washing day could not be rushed and could not realistically be squeezed around the household's other demands. Water needed heating in enormous quantities, carried in bucket after bucket from the pump in the yard, and heated over the range in a large copper vessel kept specifically for this purpose, a task alone that consumed the better part of an hour before the actual washing had even begun. The clothes themselves were sorted, as they had been sorted in households across the country for generations, roughly by colour and by degree of soiling, whites separated from colours, Thomas's shirts and collars, which required particular care and a considerable amount of starch to achieve the crisp respectability expected of a tradesman who dealt daily with the public, handled with more attention than Robert's playclothes, which received a considerably more vigorous, no-nonsense treatment. Soap, in this period, was harsh, made from tallow and lye, hard on hands that spent hours submerged in water, hot enough to properly clean but never quite comfortable, and Sarah's hands, by the end of a washing day, carry a particular redness and roughness that Eleanor notices with a quiet sympathy she rarely puts into words, though she has, on more than one occasion, quietly applied a little of her own hand cream to Sarah's knuckles at the end of a particularly hard Monday, a small gesture that costs Eleanor nothing but means, to Sarah, considerably more than either of them would ever discuss directly. The physical labour involved defies easy summary. Garments needed scrubbing against a washboard, wringing by hand or through a mangle if the household possessed one, which the Hartleys as a matter of practical thrift did, a large wooden-framed device with two rollers that Sarah cranks by hand, feeding wet fabric through to squeeze out as much water as possible before hanging, a task that leaves her arms genuinely aching by mid-morning, and that she performs nonetheless with the same steady competence she brings to every other demand of her position. Everything, once wrung, needed hanging, either in the small yard behind the house on days when weather cooperated, or, considerably more often given the unpredictability of English weather across most of the year, on lines strung through the kitchen and scullery, transforming the whole back portion of the house into a maze of damp, hanging fabric that the family moved through with the resigned good humour of people who understood this particular inconvenience as simply the price of clean clothes. Ironing followed, sometimes the same day if the weather had been kind and the drying quick, more often the following day, using flat irons heated directly on the range, a process requiring Sarah to work with 2 or 3 irons in rotation, since each one cooled within a few minutes of use and needed reheating while another took its place, a small relentless choreography that produced eventually the crisp, properly pressed clothing that a respectable household required, and that nobody outside that household ever gave a single thought to the labour behind. I find something genuinely worth sitting with in all of this, something beyond simple historical curiosity, an entire day every single week, dedicated almost exclusively to a task that most of us now complete with the press of a button and barely notice, and Sarah performed this labour not once, not as a novelty, but as the unbroken, repeating structure of her entire working life, week after week, year after year, and did so, by all evidence available to us, without complaint that anyone in the Hartley household ever recorded, simply as the ordinary shape of what her position required. Eleanor, for her part, does not stand idle on washing days, though her contribution looks considerably different from Sarah's. She manages the household's finer items herself, the lace collar she wears to church, a few delicate pieces of Alice's clothing, items she does not entirely trust to Sarah's considerably rougher handling, not from any lack of confidence in the girl's competence, but simply from the particular protectiveness a woman feels toward the few genuinely fine things she owns. This, too, tells you something about how domestic labor actually distributed itself in a household like this one. Not a strict division between a lady who did nothing and a servant who did everything, but a genuine, if unequal, partnership, each woman handling the portion of the household's needs that her particular skill or the particular value of the item in question seemed to require. Sunday afternoons, once the obligations of church have been properly observed, belong, in Sarah's small allotment of personal time, to Peter, and I think their particular courtship, modest and unhurried as it is, deserves its own proper telling, because it illustrates something true about how romance actually unfolded for ordinary young people of this class, considerably removed from the elaborate courtship rituals of the gentry that tend to dominate our popular picture of Victorian romance. Peter works at the tannery on the edge of town, a trade that leaves its mark on him in ways Sarah has grown genuinely fond of, rather than minding. A particular earthy smell that never quite washes away entirely, hands roughened by work that is, if anything, even harder than her own. He is 19, steady, a little shy in company, but considerably less so once it is just the two of them walking the path along the river that forms the customary route for young couples of their standing throughout the town. A path well known enough that half of Millbrook could probably identify at any given moment on a Sunday afternoon, roughly which couples were currently walking it, and in what stage of their respective courtships. There is no privacy in this arrangement, not really, and both Sarah and Peter understand and accept this as simply the nature of courtship at their level of society. A respectable young woman did not walk out alone with a young man in any genuinely private setting, not because anyone specifically forbade it, but because the entire weight of the community's watchful attention made such a thing essentially unthinkable. The risk to a young woman's reputation, in a town this size, considerably too great to justify whatever privacy might have been gained. So they walk, in full view of anyone who cares to notice, exchanging the small ordinary conversation of two young people genuinely fond of one another. Peter describing some incident from the tannery, Sarah offering her own small accounts of the Hartley household, careful, always, to keep her employer's business appropriately private even in these unguarded conversations, a discretion that comes naturally to her and that Eleanor, without ever explicitly testing it, trusts completely. Their courtship has been unfolding in this manner for the better part of a year now, and both of them understand, without having discussed it in any great detail, the trajectory such things generally followed among people of their circumstances. Marriage, when it eventually came, likely still some years distant, would require both of them to have saved enough between them to establish even the most modest independent household, a financial reality that shaped the pace of working-class courtship considerably more than any question of romantic feeling, which, in Sarah and Peter's case, had settled itself rather more quickly than their finances were likely to permit them to act upon. I find something genuinely touching in the patience this required of them both, a patience that our own era, accustomed to considerably less financial obstacles standing between affection and marriage, might find difficult to fully appreciate. And yet there is something in their unhurried Sunday walks, the same path, the same easy conversation, week after week, that suggests a courtship not diminished by its slow pace, but rather deepened by it, built on the accumulated weight of 100 ordinary Sunday afternoons, rather than any single dramatic gesture. Eleanor, watching Sarah return each Sunday evening with that particular unmistakable lightness in her step, has more than once found herself thinking of her own courtship with Thomas, considerably more privileged in its circumstances, but not, in its essential shape, so very different, the same slow accumulation of ordinary shared time, the same patient waiting for circumstances to align sufficiently to permit what both parties had long since privately decided they wanted. There is a particular kindness in this recognition, I think. The way Eleanor extends to her young servant's romantic life a genuine, sympathetic understanding, rather than the careless dismissal that a woman of her standing might, in a less thoughtful household, have applied to what could easily have been regarded as simply the unremarkable business of a servant girl's private time. But Eleanor has never been able to entirely separate her own remembered experience of young love from whatever version of it she observes in someone else, and this small, quiet empathy shapes, in ways neither woman would ever discuss directly, the genuine warmth that exists between them, despite the very real gulf in their respective positions. Saturday brought Millbrook's principal market day, and it is worth spending real time here too, because a market day in a town of this size operated as something considerably larger than a simple weekly shopping trip, drawing in farmers and their families from the surrounding villages, turning the market square into a genuine spectacle of noise, colour and commerce that stood in sharp contrast to the town's quieter weekday rhythm. Stalls filled the square from early morning, farmers' wives selling eggs, butter and cheese produced on their own small holdings, the eggs arranged in careful pyramids, the butter pressed into neat pounds and stamped with a decorative pattern unique to whichever farm had produced it, a small mark of pride and identification in an era before packaged goods carried printed labels to serve the same purpose. Livestock, too, changed hands on market day, and the lowing of cattle and the particular sharp smell of the animal pens set up at the square's edge mixed, not entirely comfortably, with the more appetizing smells drifting from stalls selling hot pies and gingerbread to hungry shoppers who had travelled some distance and had no intention of returning home without a proper meal first. Eleanor's own market day shopping followed a route she could have walked blindfolded, built from years of accumulated preference, this stall for the best eggs, that one for cheese, a particular farmer's wife 3 streets over who could always be relied upon for the freshest butter, and she moves through the crowded square this particular Saturday with Alice beside her, both women greeting acquaintances at nearly every stall, the whole expedition unfolding at a pace considerably slower than strict efficiency would demand, precisely because market day functioned, like so much else in this world, as social occasion every bit as much as practical errand. Twice yearly, in spring and again in early autumn, this ordinary Saturday market gave way to something considerably grander, the Millbrook Fair, and I think it deserves particular attention, because it represented for a town of this size one of the genuine highlights of the yearly calendar, an event that children like Robert looked forward to with an intensity that stretched across weeks of anticipation. The autumn fair brought travelling entertainers alongside the usual agricultural business that formed its official purpose. A man with a barrel organ and a small trained monkey that drew crowds of delighted children, a fortune teller operating out of a small tent at the square's edge, whom respectable families like the Hartleys officially disapproved of, and whom, if we are honest, more than a few respectable wives visited anyway, under cover of the general crowd and confusions, a stall selling brightly coloured ribbons and cheap trinkets that held an almost magnetic pull for every young girl in town, Alice included, despite being 19 and theoretically past the age where such things ought to hold much appeal. There were games of skill set up along one side of the square, throwing rings over prizes, a strongman contest that drew a cluster of young men eager to demonstrate exactly the kind of physical prowess that Victorian courtship customs generally discouraged them from displaying quite so directly in any other context, and toward evening, as the light began to fail, lanterns were strung between the stalls, transforming the whole square into something considerably more magical than its ordinary daytime self, a warm scattered glow against the deepening blue of an autumn evening sky. Thomas closes the shop for the full day on Fair Day, one of only a handful of occasions each year when he permits himself this particular indulgence, and the whole family attends together, a rare event in itself given how thoroughly the working week normally separates them into their respective daily occupations. Robert spends whatever small allowance his father has provided on a combination of gingerbread and a go at the ring toss, that costs him considerably more than the modest prize he eventually wins would suggest was reasonable, a piece of mathematics that entirely fails to dampen his satisfaction in the slightest. I find something genuinely lovely in watching this family move through the fair together, Thomas's usual careful reserve loosening slightly in the festive atmosphere, Eleanor laughing at something the barrel organ man's monkey does that would on any other day likely not strike her as particularly amusing at all, Alice lingering rather longer than strictly necessary at the ribbon stall, and I think there is something worth noting in how completely this single day stands apart from the household's ordinary rhythm, a reminder that even the most disciplined, respectable Victorian family understood the genuine value of occasional unashamed delight. There is another side of domestic life worth exploring here, one that touches on how a household like the Hartleys managed the ordinary small illnesses that visited every family from time to time, because the way Victorian families approached minor ailments reveals a whole quiet body of accumulated household knowledge that has largely vanished from modern life, replaced by a quick trip to a pharmacy that would have struck Eleanor as something close to miraculous. When Robert developed a troublesome cough one particular week in late autumn, nothing serious, simply the ordinary consequence of a chilly walk home in the rain a few days prior, Eleanor's response drew on a body of household remedy knowledge passed down through her own mother and her mother before that, a quiet inheritance every bit as real as the piano or the linens in the oak press. A mixture of honey and lemon, warmed gently, formed the first line of treatment, administered before bed with the particular brisk tenderness Eleanor brought to all matters concerning her children's health. A flannel, warmed by the fire and wrapped around Robert's throat and chest, provided the kind of comforting warmth that, whatever its actual medical merit, undoubtedly helped him sleep more easily. Eleanor kept in a small cabinet in the kitchen a modest collection of remedies considered standard in most households of this standing: camphorated oil for chest complaints, a tincture of something herbal for stomach upsets, all deployed with the confidence of a woman who understood, through long practical experience rather than any formal medical training, what generally worked and what did not. If a complaint persisted beyond a few days, or presented symptoms Eleanor did not feel entirely equipped to manage on her own, the family called on Dr. Marsh, a general practitioner who has served Millbrook for over 20 years, and whose visits, while not free, were considered a reasonable and necessary expense rather than an extravagance, part of the modest but real financial cushion that separated a family like the Hartleys from households with considerably less to fall back upon in moments of genuine worry. Dr. Marsh's visit for Robert's cough, which as it happened proved entirely ordinary and resolved itself within the week, with no more dramatic intervention than the continued application of Eleanor's honey and flannel, followed the familiar pattern of most such visits: a careful listening to Robert's chest through a wooden stethoscope, a few practical questions, a reassuring word to Eleanor that put an anxious mother's mind properly at ease, and a small bill that Thomas settled without complaint, understanding it as simply part of the ordinary cost of keeping a family safe and well. I want to note something here about the emotional texture of this whole small episode, because I think it says something true about family life in this period that tends to get overshadowed in our popular imagination by the era's genuinely higher rates of serious illness. For every dramatic medical crisis that fills the pages of Victorian novels, there existed countless ordinary weeks like this one: a child's minor cough, a mother's practical remedies, a doctor's reassuring visit, resolved within days and soon forgotten entirely, the unremarkable, comforting rhythm of a family simply looking after one another through the small ordinary worries that every household, in every century, has always had to work through. Eleanor sits with Robert a little longer than strictly necessary that particular evening, once the flannel has been applied and the honey and lemon administered, simply watching him settle towards sleep, and there is something in her expression, in this quiet, unguarded moment, that speaks to the particular tenderness underlying even the most practical, briskly efficient aspects of Victorian motherhood, a tenderness that the era's reputation for emotional reserve tends to obscure, but that was, in households like this one, every bit as real and present as it is in any family, in any century, watching over a child who is, this time, going to be perfectly fine. The letter, when it finally arrived, came on a Thursday morning, nearly 3 weeks after Alice had first confided in her mother on that quiet walk home from the Fenwicks' house, and I think it deserves its own proper telling, because small moments like this one, arriving through the ordinary post on an otherwise unremarkable morning, often carry considerably more weight than the grand dramatic turning points we tend to associate with a life changing. Thomas brought the post through himself that morning, as he did most mornings, and Alice, clearing the breakfast table with Sarah as she did every day, felt something shift in her chest the moment she saw the particular quality of the envelope her father was holding, official, addressed in an unfamiliar hand, postmarked from the county town. "For you," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice, a gentleness that suggested he understood, without needing to be told directly exactly what this letter likely contained. Alice took it with hands that were not quite steady, and the whole family, without any of them quite deciding to, simply stopped what they were doing and waited while she opened it, Robert pausing mid-bite of toast, Eleanor setting down the teapot she had been about to refill, Sarah lingering in the doorway between kitchen and dining room a moment longer than her duties strictly required. The letter, when Alice finally finished reading it, offered her a position, assistant to the senior mistress at a small but well-regarded girls' school in the county town, beginning after the new year, with accommodation provided as part of her salary, a genuinely respectable arrangement that would allow her to live independently, modestly but entirely on her own resources, for the first time in her life. "I got it," Alice said, and her voice when she said it carried a quality none of them had quite heard from her before, something bright and slightly disbelieving, as though she had hoped for this so long and so quietly that its actual arrival felt almost too large to properly absorb all at once. There was a moment of silence around that breakfast table that I think is worth sitting with, because it was not entirely a simple moment of celebration. Eleanor's face, in that first instant, carried something complicated, genuine joy for her daughter tangled together with the particular ache every mother feels at the prospect of a child's departure, however proud she is of the reason behind it. Thomas set down his own cup and simply looked at his daughter for a long moment before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice carried a gruffness that both women in the room understood was doing considerable work to disguise how genuinely moved he was. "Well then," he said, and there was that familiar phrase again, the same one he used every single morning to greet the day itself. "Well then, we had better see about getting you properly settled." It was, in its own understated way, a blessing every bit as complete as any more effusive declaration might have offered, and Alice understood it exactly as such. The weeks that followed brought their own particular texture to the household, a mixture of practical preparation and the quiet ongoing work of a family adjusting itself to an approaching change. Eleanor threw herself into the practical business of preparing Alice's trousseau for this new chapter, with the same careful attention she had once brought to imagining a rather different kind of trousseau, linens marked with Alice's initials, a modest wardrobe suitable for a young schoolmistress, a small trunk that Thomas purchased from a shop 2 towns over, sturdy enough to survive the journey and any journeys that might follow it. There were quiet moments, too, that never made it into the practical lists and preparations, Eleanor and Alice sitting together in the evenings, needlework largely abandoned in favour of simply talking, mother and daughter, about what this new life might actually look like, about the particular nervousness Alice felt alongside her genuine excitement, about Eleanor's own memories of leaving her childhood home for the first time, all those years ago, to marry a young draper's apprentice she had, by her own admission, not been entirely certain about until considerably after the wedding had already taken place. I find something genuinely moving in the shape this whole small drama took, precisely because it avoided every obvious dramatic turn it might have followed. There was no argument, no forbidding, no dramatic reconciliation. Simply a mother listening, a father's gruff blessing, and a household quietly, practically, lovingly making room for a daughter's chosen future, in exactly the unhurried, undemonstrative way this family seemed to approach nearly everything that genuinely mattered to them. The seasons, meanwhile, continue their own steady progress around this small ongoing family drama, and I think it is worth slowing down here, letting the year itself become part of our story for a while, because the rhythm of a Victorian household shifted considerably as the calendar turned, and there is a particular pleasure in watching that shift unfold. Autumn in Millbrook, brought its own specific texture to daily life, the high street increasingly wet underfoot as the season's rains settled in properly, the light shortening noticeably week by week, until Sarah found herself lighting lamps in the kitchen well before the family's evening meal had even begun. There is something worth noting about how thoroughly artificial light shaped Victorian evening life. A modern reader accustomed to switching on electric lighting without a second thought rarely appreciates just how much a household's activities in this period had to bend themselves around the practical limits of candlelight, oil lamps, and in slightly more prosperous homes like the Hartleys, the relatively newer luxury of gas lighting in the main rooms. Michaelmas, at the end of September, brought goose to the Hartleys' table, a modest observance of a tradition considerably older than anyone in the household could properly trace, and Eleanor's preparation of it occupied a full day of Sarah's careful attention, the bird purchased from a farmer who raised a small flock specifically for the occasion, the whole house filling, by early evening, with a rich, warm smell that Robert would later claim, with the specific hyperbole of a growing boy, as among his very favourite smells in the entire world. Bonfire night, early in November, brought its own particular excitement, a large communal fire built on the common land at the edge of town, attended by what felt like the whole of Millbrook, families gathering with roasted chestnuts and the particular delighted shrieking of children watching sparks rise into the cold night sky. Thomas allowed Robert to stay up considerably later than his usual bedtime for the occasion, a small annual indulgence that Robert anticipated for weeks beforehand and discussed for weeks afterward, and Eleanor, standing beside her husband in the crowd, the fire's warmth reaching them even at a comfortable distance, found herself thinking, not for the first time that autumn, how quickly these ordinary yearly rituals accumulated into the actual substance of a life, one bonfire night folding into the next until, somehow, an entire childhood had passed within them. But it was Christmas, arriving at the close of that same eventful autumn, that occupied the household's fullest attention, and I want to spend real time here because Victorian Christmas customs, many of which feel entirely familiar to us now, were, in this particular decade, still in the process of settling into the shape we would recognize today, a fact that makes exploring them considerably more interesting than simply cataloguing traditions we already know well. Preparations began in earnest well before December arrived, Eleanor and Sarah working together over several weeks on the Christmas pudding, a task that involved the whole household in its traditional stirring, each family member, including Robert with considerable ceremony, and even Thomas, briefly leaving the shop to take his own turn, giving the mixture a stir and making a private wish while doing so, a custom that Eleanor's own mother had observed, and that Eleanor continued without any particular reflection on where it had originally come from, simply as one more small thread connecting her own household to the household she had known as a child. The tree itself, a custom that had grown considerably in popularity across England following the fondness for it demonstrated by the royal family some decades earlier, occupied a modest but genuine place of honour in the Hartleys' parlour this particular year, decorated with small candles that Sarah lit with careful attention on Christmas Eve, strict enough about fire safety that Thomas insisted on remaining in the room the entire time the candles burned, and simple ornaments, some purchased, some made by Alice and Robert together over several evenings in early December, paper chains and small fabric decorations that carried, in their homemade imperfection, considerably more warmth than anything Thomas's own shop might have offered for purchase. Church on Christmas morning drew a fuller congregation than any ordinary Sunday, the parish church decorated with holly and ivy gathered from the hedgerows surrounding the town, the vicar's sermon, for once considerably less practical and considerably more genuinely joyful in its tone, and the whole town, walking home afterward, carried a particular collective warmth that Eleanor found herself savouring, this sense of an entire community, whatever its ordinary daily divisions of rank and station, briefly united in shared celebration. Christmas dinner itself, prepared by Sarah, with what amounted to weeks of accumulated preparation compressed into a single demanding day, brought roast goose again, this time considerably more elaborate than the modest Michaelmas bird, accompanied by all the trimmings a household of the Hartleys' modest prosperity could reasonably provide, and the pudding, finally served with considerable ceremony, doused in brandy and set alight briefly at the table, a small dramatic flourish that never failed to delight Robert, regardless of how many times he had already witnessed it in his short life. Gifts, this particular Christmas, remained modest by any modern standard, practical items mostly, a new pair of gloves for Alice to take with her to a new position, a book for Robert, a length of particularly fine wool that Thomas had set aside from the shop's stock for Eleanor, knowing precisely which shade would suit her best after so many years of watching her make exactly such choices for other women across his own counter. But there was, this year, one gift that carried considerably more weight than its modest size suggested, a small framed photograph, an increasingly fashionable novelty that Thomas had arranged with a photographer from the county town some weeks earlier. The whole family posed formally, stiffly, in their very best clothes, a keepsake Alice would carry with her to a new position and keep, for the rest of her life, on the small table beside whatever bed she happened to be sleeping in, a fixed and permanent reminder of exactly this household, exactly this family, exactly this particular Christmas before everything, gently and irreversibly, began to change. Let us slow down properly now, and spend some time simply dwelling in the physical texture of a Victorian winter, because there is a particular richness in it that deserves more than a passing mention, the kind of detail that rewards lingering rather than hurrying past. Keeping a household warm through an English winter, in a period before central heating existed in any form, required a constant active labour that we now take almost entirely for granted. The Hartleys' house was heated room by room, fire by fire, and Sarah's mornings through the coldest months began not merely with the kitchen range, but with the laborious business of laying and lighting fires in whichever other rooms the family expected to use that day. The parlour always, sometimes Eleanor and Thomas's bedroom if the cold had turned particularly bitter, coal carried up in scuttles from the cellar where it was delivered in bulk each autumn by a coalman whose visits, with his blackened hands and the particular acrid smell that clung to him, Robert found endlessly fascinating. There is a specific layered cold that settles into an unheated Victorian bedroom overnight that I think is worth properly imagining because it shapes so much of how this household actually experienced winter. Eleanor and Thomas slept beneath a considerable weight of blankets, and beneath those, in the coldest weeks, a stone hot water bottle, wrapped carefully in flannel to prevent scalding, filled each night from the kitchen kettle and slipped between the sheets an hour or so before bed, so that by the time the family actually climbed in, the worst of the bed's chill had already been driven off. Washing, on winter mornings, involved water that had more than once developed a thin skin of ice in the jug overnight, a bracing shock that Alice in particular dreaded and endured with the same stoic resignation her mother had modelled for her since childhood, because there was, quite simply, no alternative available to a household of this standing hot water, requiring advanced planning and labour that could not always be justified for something as ordinary as morning washing. Bath night, once weekly, typically Saturday in preparation for Sunday church, brought its own considerable production, a tin bath filled with water heated over the range and carried through in successive jugs, positioned before the kitchen fire for warmth and a measure of privacy once the rest of the household had cleared the room. The order in which family members bathed followed a logic dictated largely by the practical limits of hot water rather than any strict rule of precedence, though Thomas, as the family's principal breadwinner and generally the most travel-worn from his day, was often afforded the first turn in genuinely fresh, hot water, with the same water topped up and reheated where possible, serving the rest of the household in turn, a practicality that would strike most modern readers as faintly uncomfortable, and that nobody in this household, accustomed entirely to its logic, thought twice about. I find something quietly remarkable in how much sheer physical labour sat behind even this most basic weekly comfort. Water carried, heated, carried again, and how completely that labour disappeared from view once the actual moment of bathing arrived. Warm water, a fire crackling nearby, the particular deep physical relief of finally being properly clean and warm after a week spent contending with a cold that never entirely left the house through the winter months. The nights themselves, this time of year, carried their own particular quality, a stillness deepened by the early darkness and the cold, the family gathering closer around the parlour fire than they did in milder seasons. Thomas's newspaper reading punctuated more frequently by the specific comfortable silence of a household that has, for the moment, nowhere it needs to be, and nothing more pressing than simply staying warm together until bedtime finally, gently, claims them. Outside, beyond the curtained windows, the high street itself transformed under winter's particular conditions. Snow when it came settling thick and quiet over the cobblestones, muffling every sound until the whole town seemed to hold its breath, the gas lamps along the street casting warm pools of light against the blue-grey dusk that fell. This time of year, well before the shops had finished their day's business. There is something in this image I find genuinely worth holding on to. An entire small English town, wrapped in early winter darkness, each house glowing faintly with its own small fire, its own small gathered family, the whole community somehow both entirely separate, each household closed up warm against the cold, and entirely connected, every one of them enduring precisely the same season, the same darkness, the same quiet waiting for spring, together, without ever needing to say so out loud. The new year arrived quietly, as it generally did in a household not given to elaborate celebration, though Thomas did open a small bottle of sherry kept specifically for the occasion, and the family stayed up together, unusually, until the church bells rang out across the town at midnight, marking the year's turn with a sound that carried clearly through the cold, still air. And then, within the first week of January, the day arrived that the whole household had been, in its own quiet way, preparing for since that Thursday morning breakfast so many weeks before. Alice's departure was arranged for a Tuesday, a choice of day that carried no particular significance beyond the practical scheduling of the coach that would carry her to the county town, and I think the morning itself deserves a proper telling, because it captures something true about how this family expressed feelings that Victorian convention generally discouraged them from stating too directly. Sarah had Alice's trunk down and ready by the door well before breakfast, packed the evening before with the particular care of a girl who understood, better than most, exactly how much a person's whole material life could sometimes fit into a single sturdy container, and who had, over the preceding weeks, quietly folded into that trunk not merely the linens and clothing that were its official contents, but a small collection of dried lavender from Eleanor's own supply, tucked discreetly among the folded garments, a parting gift Sarah had prepared without saying anything to anyone, understanding instinctively that Alice would find it, eventually, and would understand exactly what it meant. Breakfast that final morning carried a particular quality none of them quite named directly, Thomas checking his pocket watch rather more frequently than the actual time required, Robert unusually quiet, having only in these last few days properly absorbed the reality that his sister, his constant companion across his entire remembered childhood, was genuinely about to no longer live in the room next to his own. "Write to us properly," Eleanor said, more than once, in the hour before the coach was due, fussing with details that scarcely needed fussing over, straightening a collar that was already perfectly straight, and Alice, understanding exactly what her mother's particular brand of fussing actually meant, let her do it without protest, recognizing it as the only language available to Eleanor in this moment for saying everything else she could not quite bring herself to say plainly. The coach arrived precisely on schedule, and there was, in the small flurry of activity that followed, the trunk loaded, the fare confirmed, scarcely a proper moment for the kind of extended farewell the occasion might have seemed to warrant. Thomas embraced his daughter briefly, gruffly, and said, in a voice that was not entirely steady despite his evident effort to keep it so, "You make us proud," and there was nothing more he needed to add to that. Eleanor's own farewell came last, and I think it is worth dwelling on, because it captures, better than almost anything else in this whole small family drama, the particular quality of a mother's love expressed within the considerable emotional restraint that Victorian convention generally demanded. She held her daughter's face in both hands for a long moment, said nothing at all for that first moment, and then simply, quietly, "You will do wonderfully. I have always known you would." Alice, climbing into the coach a few minutes later, found a window and pressed her hand briefly against the cold glass, watching her family, her whole known world, standing together on the high street, growing gradually smaller as the coach pulled away, and she cried, quietly, for perhaps the first mile of the journey, not from any regret, but from the particular overwhelming fullness of a heart that has just been handed, all at once, both an ending and a genuine beginning. Eleanor, standing beside Thomas long after the coach had disappeared around the bend in the road, found her own composure considerably more difficult to maintain than she had expected, and Thomas, understanding without needing to be told, simply put his arm around her shoulders and let her stand there a while longer than the cold January morning strictly recommended, the two of them watching an empty stretch of road that their daughter had, only moments before, occupied. "Well then," Thomas said finally, the same familiar phrase, offered now in a voice considerably gentler than its usual morning delivery, and Eleanor, hearing it, felt something in her chest ease very slightly, this small, worn, familiar phrase doing exactly the work it had always done in this household, marking the acceptance of whatever the day required, and the quiet decision to simply carry on. The house, in the weeks that followed, carried a particular quiet that none of them quite got used to, though each member of the household adjusted to it in their own way. Robert, somewhat to his own surprise, missed his sister's presence at the breakfast table more than he had anticipated, finding the room noticeably duller without her particular running commentary on whatever book she happened to be reading, and he took, in a habit that touched Eleanor considerably more than she let on, to occasionally reading aloud himself in the evenings now, a rather less polished performance than Alice's had been, but offered with a genuine earnest effort to fill the small gap his sister's absence had left in the household's evening rhythm. Eleanor found her own adjustment considerably more complicated, the particular ache of a mother whose daily maternal duties have, quite suddenly, contracted by one whole person, and she filled some portion of that quiet with letters, writing to Alice twice weekly at first, gradually settling into a rhythm of once a week that both women maintained faithfully for years afterward, a correspondence that Eleanor kept, every single letter, tied together with ribbon and stored in the same small trunk that had once held Alice's own childhood keepsakes. Alice's letters, when they arrived, offered the household its first real window into her new life, and I want to share a little of what she described, because it paints a genuinely vivid picture of what a young Victorian woman's professional life, modest as it was by any grand standard, actually looked like from the inside. The school itself, she wrote, was housed in a converted merchant's house on the outskirts of the county town, home to some 30 girls, boarders mostly, daughters of families a little more prosperous than the Hartleys, drapers and solicitors, and the occasional minor professional family sent to acquire the same kind of accomplishments Alice herself had once studied, music and French and enough arithmetic to manage a future household properly. Alice's own role as assistant to the senior mistress involved a considerable range of duties, supervising the younger girls' morning routines, taking a portion of the music instruction herself, and gradually, as her confidence grew, being trusted with rather more of the actual teaching than her initial modest title had suggested she might expect. She described her small room, considerably smaller than her bedroom at home but entirely her own, in a way nothing had quite been before. A window looking out over the school's modest garden, a desk where she now composed her own letters home in the quiet hour before the younger girl's bedtime duties required her attention. She described the senior mistress, a formidable but ultimately kind woman named Miss Pargeter, who had, Alice noted with evident relief, taken rather quickly to her, and the small friendships she had begun forming with two of the other young mistresses, women in circumstances remarkably similar to her own, each of them navigating this same particular, still somewhat novel path of independent female employment. There is something I find genuinely worth pausing on in these letters, something beyond simple family news. Alice, in her own careful, considered phrasing, was describing nothing less than the early shape of a genuinely different kind of womanhood than the one her own mother had lived. Not in opposition to it, Alice remained, throughout her letters, warmly affectionate toward the family and the household she had grown up within, but in addition to it, a widening of what a respectable woman's life might actually contain, achieved not through any dramatic rebellion, but through the quiet, patient accumulation of small choices, a letter written, a position accepted, a life gradually, carefully built. Eleanor read each of these letters with a complicated mixture of feelings that I think most parents, in any century, would recognize instantly. Genuine pride sitting alongside a persistent low ache of missing her daughter's actual physical presence in the house, and a quiet, growing wonder at watching a person she had raised become, gradually, someone she had not entirely anticipated, someone whose life was beginning to extend into territory Eleanor's own had never touched. Spring, when it finally arrived that year, brought its own particular relief to the household, the way it always did after the long grip of an English winter, and Millbrook's High Street gradually shed its winter closeness, doors propped open on milder afternoons, the greengrocer's crates filling again with the first tentative produce of the new growing season, the whole town seeming to exhale after months spent quietly enduring the cold. Thomas's shop window, dressed each Monday with his usual careful attention, shifted its offerings accordingly, lighter fabrics beginning to appear alongside the heavier winter wools, and Eleanor found herself, on the first genuinely warm afternoon of the year, opening the parlour windows for the first time in months, letting the particular fresh green smell of an English spring drift through the house, mingling with the last lingering trace of the winter fires that had, for so many months, been the household's constant quiet companion. Let us turn our attention to Robert for a while now, because his own quiet story, unfolding rather more slowly than his sister's, deserves its own proper telling, and it offers us a chance to explore a whole different corner of Victorian middle-class life, the particular question of what a family like the Hartleys imagined for a son, as opposed to a daughter, and how those imaginings actually took shape over years rather than months. Robert, by this point a full head taller than he had been at the start of our story, and possessed of the particular gangly restlessness that seems to overtake boys of a certain age all at once, had begun, in the ordinary course of his grammar school education, to show a genuine aptitude for figures considerably more pronounced than his enthusiasm for Latin had ever managed to be, and this small fact, noticed first by his schoolmaster and mentioned to Thomas at a chance meeting on the High Street, set in motion a whole quiet family conversation about Robert's eventual prospects that would occupy considerable attention over the following 2 years. Thomas had, for a time, rather assumed that Robert might eventually take over the shop itself, a natural enough expectation for a man who had built something genuinely worth inheriting, but he found himself watching his son's evident talent for arithmetic and his rather more evident lack of enthusiasm for the drapery trade specifically, gradually setting that particular assumption aside in favor of something considerably more suited to the boy actually in front of him, rather than the son he might once have imagined. There is something worth noting here about how Victorian fathers of this middling class actually approached questions of a son's future, something considerably more thoughtful, in households like the Hartleys, than the popular image of rigid patriarchal expectation might suggest. Thomas discussed the matter with Eleanor at length over several evenings, the two of them weighing Robert's evident strengths against the range of respectable occupations genuinely available to a boy of his standing, a clerkship perhaps, in a solicitor's office or a bank, positions that required precisely the combination of numerical competence and careful, legible handwriting that Robert, once properly motivated, proved entirely capable of producing. By the time Robert turned 14, the family had settled, after considerable discussion that included, notably, a genuine conversation with Robert himself about his own preferences, a degree of consultation that would have been considerably less common in a family of lower standing, where a boy's labour was often needed too urgently to permit much consideration of his personal inclination, on a clerkship arranged through Thomas's own acquaintance with a solicitor in the county town, a Mr. Fenwick's colleague as it happened, the connections of small-town professional life proving, once again, genuinely useful in shaping a young person's practical prospects. Robert's departure from the household, when it eventually came, carried its own particular echo of Alice's earlier leaving, a smaller trunk, a similar coach, a similarly gruff, deeply felt farewell from Thomas, and a similarly composed, quietly aching one from Eleanor, though by this point, having already lived through one child's departure, both parents managed the second with a little more practiced steadiness, if not, in truth, any less genuine feeling underneath it. I find something worth sitting with in this whole gradual unfolding, the way an ordinary household central story, over the span of just a few years, moved so completely from the noisy, crowded fullness of children still living beneath the family roof, to the quieter, more spacious rhythm of a household gradually emptying, each departure a genuine loss and a genuine achievement simultaneously, the whole complicated bittersweet arithmetic of parenthood that every generation in every century eventually has to work through in its own way. Thomas and Eleanor, in the months following Robert's departure, found their own household routines settling into a new, quieter shape. The shop still occupying Thomas's days exactly as it always had, Eleanor's own domestic responsibilities gradually easing as the demands of a house with fewer people in it naturally required less of everything, less washing, less cooking, less of the constant low-level management that a full household of growing children had always demanded. There was in this new quiet a particular kind of companionship between husband and wife that neither of them had experienced quite so fully since their own early years of marriage, before children had arrived to occupy so much of their combined attention. And I think there is something genuinely lovely in watching a long marriage rediscover, in its middle years, some of the easy, uncomplicated closeness of its very beginning, the two of them, most evenings now, simply sitting together in the parlour, Thomas with his newspaper, Eleanor with whatever needlework the household still required, the room quieter than it had been in years, and, in its own way, no less content for the change. Sarah's own story reached its own quiet turning point not long after Robert's departure, and I think it deserves its proper telling too, because it closes a thread we began following so long ago now, on that very first morning, watching her light the range in the cold before anyone else in the household had stirred. Peter proposed, as it turned out, in the spring following Robert's departure, on their usual Sunday walk along the river, and the proposal itself, by Sarah's own later account, given to Eleanor over tea not long afterward, with the particular shy pleasure of a young woman still slightly disbelieving of her own good fortune, was entirely unremarkable in its actual staging, no grand gesture, simply Peter stopping on the familiar path, turning to face her properly, and asking, with a directness that suited him considerably better than any elaborate speech might have, whether she would have him. The two of them had, by this point, been saving carefully for the better part of 2 years. Peter's wages from the tannery and whatever small portion of her own modest earnings Sarah had managed to set aside, and the sum, while never large by any comfortable standard, had finally reached the point where a genuinely independent household, however humble, sat within reach. Eleanor's reaction, when Sarah finally worked up the courage to give her proper notice, carried a warmth that surprised Sarah rather less than it might have surprised an outside observer, given everything we have already come to understand about the genuine, if unequal, affection between these two women. There were tears, on Eleanor's part considerably more than she expected of herself, and a genuine, practical generosity too, Eleanor insisting on contributing a set of linens to Sarah's own small trousseau, the same careful embroidered initials Alice had once worked into her own linens now applied, at Eleanor's specific instruction, to a set intended for a young woman who had spent nearly a decade keeping this particular household running with a quiet competence nobody in the family had ever taken entirely for granted. Sarah and Peter married that summer, in the same parish church that had witnessed the Hartleys' own wedding some 15 years earlier, a modest ceremony attended by both families and, notably, by Thomas and Eleanor themselves, an attendance that spoke to genuine warmth rather than mere obligation, and the small house they eventually established, 2 streets from the tannery where Peter continued working, became, over the following years, the site of its own gradually unfolding family story, one that Eleanor followed with real interest whenever their paths crossed on the high street. Sarah's own eventual children greeted, always, with the particular fondness of a woman who had, in her own way, helped raise the girl now raising them. The household required, of course, a new arrangement following Sarah's departure, and a girl named Martha, 16 and considerably green in her duties compared to Sarah's long-practiced competence, arrived within a fortnight to take up the position, and I find something worth noting in how completely this small transition mirrored the household's very first morning, all those years earlier, someone new learning the particular rhythm of this particular house, the range that needed a certain touch to light properly, the family's particular preferences and habits, the whole quiet architecture of domestic knowledge that Sarah had spent nearly a decade accumulating now needing to be rebuilt, patiently, by someone else entirely. Eleanor found herself, in training Martha through those early weeks, thinking often of her own younger self, standing in this same kitchen with a girl considerably less experienced than the household actually required, and there was something almost circular in it, the way a house like this one seemed to hold within it an endlessly repeating pattern of arrival and departure, each person passing through leaving their own small mark before making way, eventually, for whoever came next. The household itself somehow both entirely changed and entirely unchanged across all these small successive transitions. Let us widen our view a little now and spend some proper time with the town itself, because Millbrook, across these same years we have been following the Hartley household, carried on its own steady existence, and there is a great deal of quiet richness in it worth exploring before we settle back into our particular family's story. The blacksmith's forge at the edge of town nearest the main road operated on a rhythm entirely its own, the ringing of hammer against anvil audible across a surprising distance on a still morning, and the smith himself, a broad, quiet man named Mr. Yardley, shod horses for the farmers bringing produce into market and repaired the endless small metal necessities of a town that depended, in this period, on iron and horsepower for nearly everything requiring genuine strength or distance. Children gathered sometimes at a respectful distance to watch him work, drawn by the particular drama of sparks flying from hot metal, a spectacle that Robert, in his younger years, had found nearly as compelling as the fair's travelling entertainers. The carpenter's workshop, a little further along, filled the air with the specific sweet smell of fresh sawdust, and produced everything from household furniture to the coffins that, however carefully this story has avoided dwelling on loss, every town of this size necessarily required from time to time. The carpenter himself, a Mr. Boswell, known throughout Millbrook for the particular careful quality of his joinery, a reputation built over decades and passed down, eventually, to his own son, who apprenticed under him in the same workshop where his father had learnt the trade from his own father before that. The post office, situated in a small building beside the bank, served as its own quiet hub of town life, and the postmaster, a Mr. Cribbins, possessed of an encyclopedic knowledge of every family's correspondence patterns that bordered on the genuinely remarkable, functioned as an unofficial repository of local news simply by virtue of noticing, over years of handling the mail, which households received letters from which distant places, and drawing his own quiet conclusions about sons gone to sea, daughters married into distant counties, relatives emigrated to Canada or Australia in search of opportunities Millbrook itself could not provide. I find something genuinely worth pausing on in this last detail, because it points towards something larger about Victorian England that our story, focused as it has been on one small town, has not yet properly addressed. This was an era of enormous movement, families scattering across the growing empire and beyond it in search of land, opportunity, a different kind of life than the one available to them at home, and even a town as settled and unremarkable as Millbrook felt the effects of this larger restlessness. A nephew of Mrs. Prentice's gone to Australia some years back, working now, by all reports reaching her through infrequent treasured letters, on a sheep station somewhere in a landscape she could scarcely picture, a cousin of Thomas's own settled in Canada, the whole wider world gradually, quietly, becoming rather less distant than it had been for his own father's generation. The church bells marked the hours across the town with a regularity that shaped everyone's sense of time in a way that feels almost foreign to us now, accustomed as we are to carrying the precise time in our own pockets. And there was a particular quality to how sound travelled across Millbrook, the bells most of all, but also the blacksmith's hammer, the market day crowds, the particular hush that fell over the whole town on a Sunday afternoon when nearly every shop stood closed and nearly every family had retreated into their own quiet domestic world. Evening in the town, across all the years of our story, carried its own consistent, comforting rhythm, the shops closing in careful sequence along the high street, the lamplighter making his rounds in reverse of his dawn routine now, each gas lamp flaring softly to life as he passed, the windows of houses along every street gradually filling with warm lamplight as families gathered for their own evening meals, and somewhere, always, the particular distant sound of a dog settling for the night, a door closing, a voice calling a child in from play, the whole accumulated texture of an ordinary English town easing itself, day after day, year after year, towards sleep. I want you to hold that image for a moment, this whole small world, every house glowing faintly against the deepening dark, every family within it occupied with its own particular version of exactly what we have been watching the Hartleys do all this while, and I think there is something genuinely worth finding comfort in. The knowledge that whatever quiet, ordinary evening you yourself are settling into right now, you are joining a tradition considerably older and considerably more universal than any single story could properly capture. This simple human business of gathering, at the close of an ordinary day, into whatever warmth and company you have managed to build for yourself. Let us return now to Thomas and Eleanor themselves, because their own story, quieter than their children's in these later years, deserves its own careful attention, and there is a particular kind of comfort, I think, in watching an ordinary marriage simply continue, year after year, through no drama more significant than the steady accumulation of shared ordinary time. The shop continued to occupy the greater portion of Thomas's days, though he had by this point taken on a young assistant, a boy of 16 named Alfred, who reminded Thomas more than he would ever say aloud of his own younger self, eager and a little rough around the edges, gradually being shaped into the kind of careful, patient tradesman that Thomas himself had become over his own many years behind that same counter. Training Alfred brought Thomas a particular quiet satisfaction, the sense of a trade and a way of conducting oneself being properly passed along, and he found himself, in unguarded moments, offering the boy small pieces of accumulated wisdom that had nothing directly to do with fabric or ribbon, and everything to do with the particular patience good business required, the same patience Thomas had once extended to Mrs. Ainsworth over her ribbon selection all those years ago, now offered as instruction to a young man who would, some day, extend that same patience to customers Thomas himself would never meet. Eleanor's own days, gradually lightened of the constant demands a full household of growing children had once required, found new shape in ways that surprised her. She took on a more active role in the church's charitable work, organizing, alongside several other women of similar standing, a modest but genuinely useful scheme, providing warm clothing to the poorer families at the edge of town through the winter months, work that drew on exactly the same practical domestic competence that had once managed her own household, and that she found, somewhat to her own surprise, deeply satisfying to direct toward a wider purpose. She wrote to Alice weekly without fail for years, and the letters that came back described, over time, Alice's own gradual rise within the school, from assistant mistress to, eventually, a position of genuine seniority, and eventually, in a development that brought Eleanor a particular complicated joy, Alice's own marriage, considerably later than convention generally preferred, to a solicitor in the county town who had, by Alice's own account, fallen for her steady, capable manner at a social gathering arranged by Miss Pargeter, and had spent a full year in patient, careful courtship before Alice, satisfied that this particular arrangement would not require her to abandon the professional life she had built so carefully, finally agreed to marry him. I find something genuinely worth noting in the shape Alice's eventual marriage took, because it illustrates something true about how the era's rigid expectations, for all their genuine constraint, nonetheless contained more flexibility than we sometimes assume. Alice did not entirely abandon her teaching upon marriage, continuing in a reduced capacity at the same school for several years afterward, an arrangement her husband, evidently a man of genuinely progressive temperament for his time, supported without apparent reservation, and Eleanor, reading of this arrangement in her daughter's careful, considered letters, found herself feeling a particular pride considerably larger than she had anticipated feeling on the occasion of her daughter's marriage, pride not merely in the marriage itself, but in the whole shape of the life Alice had managed to build around it. Robert's own path, meanwhile, continued its own steady progress, the clerkship gradually becoming something more substantial as his evident competence with figures and his careful, reliable manner earned him increasing responsibility, and by his mid-20s, letters home described a young man well on his way toward the kind of solid, respectable professional standing his parents had once carefully imagined for him, and had, watching from a distance that grew gradually less painful with each passing year, the particular satisfaction of seeing exactly come to pass. There is something I want to sit with here, before we move toward the close of our evening together, something about how completely an ordinary family's story, across enough years, comes to resemble less a single dramatic narrative and more a kind of accumulated weather, seasons folding into seasons, small joys and small worries arriving and passing, children departing and eventually, in their turn, writing home about children of their own, the whole slow, patient, largely unremarkable business of an ordinary life properly, thoroughly lived. Thomas and Eleanor, growing quietly older together in the same house where we first met them, watching the high street outside their window continue its own steady daily rhythm, found in this accumulated ordinary weather something I think most of us, if we are honest, actually want from our own lives. Not drama, not spectacle, simply the steady accumulated warmth of a life well and thoroughly lived, alongside people genuinely loved, in a place that had, over so many years, become entirely and completely home. Let us slow all the way down now, and spend our remaining time together simply sitting inside one more ordinary evening in this house, years after everything we have just described, because I think there is something genuinely restful in returning, at the close of a story, to the same quiet textures where we first began. It is autumn again, a good many years on from that first morning we spent watching Sarah light the range in the cold dark before dawn, and the high street outside the Hartleys' window has settled into its familiar evening rhythm. The shops closed now, the lamplighters' rounds long since completed, windows glowing warm and steady along the length of the street. Thomas sits in his particular chair nearest the fire, a little greyer now than when we first met him, his newspaper held slightly further from his eyes than it once needed to be, a small accommodation to years that have otherwise treated him kindly. The shop still occupies his days, Alfred managing rather more of it now than he once did, and Thomas finds himself, in these later years, taking rather more genuine pleasure in the quiet evening hours than he perhaps once did, when the demands of a younger household left less time for simply sitting still. Eleanor sits across from him, her own needlework considerably reduced now, a small piece intended eventually for a grandchild, Alice's second, expected sometime in the new year, and there is a particular contentment in her expression this evening that comes, I think, from the specific satisfaction of a woman who has spent her whole adult life building something and can now, in these quieter years, simply watch it continue, gently, of its own accumulated momentum. The fire settles with a small soft collapse of coals, the sound it always makes at roughly this hour, and somewhere beyond a window, faint and familiar, a dog barks twice in the darkening street, the same particular sound, though of course a different dog by now, that opened our whole story so many hours ago. I want you to notice, if you can, how completely this evening rhymes with that first morning we spent together. The same house, the same particular quality of light and shadow, the same small domestic sounds that have carried this family, this street, this entire small town, through so many accumulated years of ordinary living. There is a comfort in that rhyme, I think, the sense that whatever changes, whatever children grow and depart and build their own separate lives, some essential texture of a place, of a family, of an evening spent quietly by a fire, persists, largely unchanged, decade after decade. A letter arrived that morning from Robert, now settled in his own household some distance away, married 2 years past to a solicitor's daughter he met through his work, and Eleanor has read it perhaps 4 times already today, each time finding some small new detail to appreciate, a description of his own young son's first uncertain steps, a small complaint about his own employer that carries, underneath its mild grumbling, the unmistakable satisfaction of a man genuinely settled into a life he finds worth living. Thomas lowers his newspaper eventually, catching Eleanor's eye across the small distance between their 2 chairs, and there passes between them, in that particular unhurried glance, the whole accumulated weight of everything we have spent this evening exploring together, a shop built from nothing but patient labour, 2 children raised and launched successfully into their own separate lives, a household managed through countless ordinary Mondays and Christmases and quiet Tuesday evenings, a marriage that has, across all these years, simply continued, steadily, warmly, without ever requiring more drama than the ordinary business of 2 people choosing, again and again, across thousands of accumulated evenings just like this one, to build a life together. Well then, Thomas says, and Eleanor smiles, recognizing, as she always does, exactly what the small worn phrase is doing, this quiet acknowledgement of an evening well spent, a day properly closed, nothing more required of either of them now than simply sitting together a while longer before the fire finally burns down and bed gently begins to call them both. Outside, the town continues its own slow settling into night, windows dimming one by one along the length of the high street as families finish their own evenings and retire, the occasional distant sound of a door closing, a voice calling good night, the whole accumulated texture of an ordinary English town easing itself, exactly as it has every single night of this story, towards sleep. I find myself telling you all of this, genuinely reluctant to let this particular evening end, and I think that reluctance is worth noticing, because it points towards something true about why stories like this one, ordinary as their contents genuinely are, hold such a particular comfort for those of us listening from so many years and so much distance away. There is nothing here to fear, nothing dramatic waiting around any corner, simply the steady, accumulated warmth of ordinary lives, ordinary lived, and I think there is a real comfort available in simply resting inside that knowledge for a while, letting the particular quiet rhythm of this household's evening become gently your own. There is one more thread of this story worth following before we let the evening close entirely, because change, even in a town as steady and unhurried as Millbrook, arrived eventually, gradually, the way it always does, and I think it is worth spending a little time with how the wider world's advancing machinery gradually found its way even into this small, largely unremarkable corner of England. The railway reached a station some 4 miles outside Millbrook proper partway through our story, a development that Thomas, along with most of the town's tradesmen, greeted with a mixture of genuine enthusiasm and mild apprehension. Enthusiasm for the considerably faster, cheaper access it offered to goods from the county town and beyond, apprehension at the prospect of larger, more efficiently supplied shops in nearby towns becoming suddenly, uncomfortably, more accessible to Millbrook's own customers than they had ever been before. In practice, the railway proved, over the following years, rather more benefit than threat to a business like Thomas's own. Fabric that had once taken the better part of a week to arrive from the county town's wholesalers now arrived within a day or two, allowing Thomas to keep his stock considerably more current with fashionable trends than had previously been practical, and the occasional trip to the county town itself, once a genuine undertaking requiring the better part of a day by road, became, via the new station, a matter of an hour or so each way, opening up, for a family like the Hartleys, a whole new practical accessibility to the wider world that would have seemed almost fantastical to Thomas's own father's generation. The telegraph, too, arrived eventually, a small office established beside the post office, and though the Hartleys themselves had little routine occasion to use it, its mere presence in the town marked, in its own quiet way, a genuine shift in how thoroughly Millbrook now sat connected to events and information from across the whole country. News of significant happenings reaching the town within hours, rather than the days or weeks such information had once required to travel by more traditional means. I find something worth noting in how calmly this whole gradual technological transformation was absorbed into the town's existing rhythm, rather than displacing it entirely. The market still operated on Saturdays exactly as it always had. Church still anchored the week's social calendar exactly as it always had. Thomas still dressed his shop window with the same careful attention every Monday morning, whatever new efficiencies the railway had introduced into how his stock actually arrived. Change in a town like this tended to layer itself gently over existing custom rather than sweeping it away entirely, and I think there is something genuinely comforting in that particular pattern. The way genuine progress, properly absorbed, need not require the wholesale abandonment of everything that came before it. Sarah and Peter's own small household, meanwhile, had grown considerably over these same years. 3 children now, the eldest already old enough to have taken up a position himself, apprenticed to Mr. Boswell the carpenter, in an arrangement Peter had negotiated with the same patient, unhurried competence he brought to everything else in his life. Sarah, watching her own eldest son walk off each morning to his apprenticeship, found herself thinking often of her own years in the Hartley household, the particular texture of that early rising, that patient accumulation of skill and responsibility, and felt, watching her son begin his own version of that same journey, a very particular, deeply satisfied pride. Eleanor and Sarah's own friendship, unlikely as its origins might have seemed to an outside observer all those years ago, had settled, over this same stretch of time, into something genuinely comfortable and enduring. The two women meeting for tea perhaps once a fortnight, their conversation ranging easily across children and grandchildren, and the whole accumulated small news of a town that both of them, in their very different ways, had spent their entire adult lives helping to sustain. There is something I want to leave you with here, before we finally let this particular evening, and this particular story, ease all the way into rest. The gulf that separated Eleanor and Sarah, mistress and servant, at the very start of our story, never entirely dissolved. Not really. The actual structures of Victorian class remained, throughout all these years, exactly as real and exactly as present as they had always been. And yet something else grew alongside that unchanged structure, a genuine warmth, a genuine mutual respect, built patiently across a decade and more of shared daily life. Proof, I think, that even within a social system as rigid as this one, individual human kindness found, again and again, its own quiet ways of reaching across whatever formal distance the era insisted upon maintaining. Let us spend a little time now with two other households in Millbrook, ones we have glimpsed only briefly across this evening, because I think they round out our picture of this small town's particular social texture in ways worth properly exploring before we finally settle toward our own rest. Dr. Marsh, whom we met tending to Robert's ordinary childhood cough, occupied a curious position within Millbrook's social hierarchy, respected considerably above a tradesman like Thomas in the formal calculus of Victorian professional standing, and yet, in the particular practical reality of small-town life, genuinely dependent on maintaining warm, trusting relationships with families across every level of the town's social ladder, since illness, unlike commerce, made no particular distinction between customer and patient based on their standing. His own household, a solid stone house set slightly apart from the high street's commercial bustle, ran according to a rhythm shaped considerably by the unpredictable demands of his profession, meals delayed or interrupted by a sudden call to a patient, his wife Mrs. Marsh managing the household with the particular resigned competence of a woman long accustomed to her husband's schedule, belonging, fundamentally, rather more to Millbrook's collective health than to any fixed domestic timetable. There is something worth noting in how genuinely respected Dr. Marsh's profession had become across this particular century, medicine gradually professionalizing itself over these same decades into something considerably more systematic and scientifically grounded than the rather more haphazard practice his own father, also a doctor, had conducted a generation earlier, and the Marsh household's standing in the town rose correspondingly, a quiet reflection of medicine's own gradually strengthening claim to genuine scientific legitimacy. The vicar's household, Mr. and Mrs. Ainsworth, whom we met so briefly at the very start of our story, deliberating over ribbon, occupied its own particular position, socially elevated by virtue of the Church's inherent authority, and yet, in practice, often genuinely modest in its actual material circumstances. Clergy livings in this period, varying enormously in value, and Mr. Ainsworth's own particular parish, while respectable, provided an income that required the same kind of careful household management the Hartleys themselves practiced, rather than the effortless comfort a casual observer might assume automatically accompanied a clergyman's inherently elevated social standing. Mrs. Ainsworth, in fact, became, over the years we have been following, something genuinely close to a proper friend of Eleanor's, the two women's paths crossing constantly through the Church's various charitable activities, and their friendship, built on considerably more equal social footing than Eleanor's relationship with Sarah, carried its own particular warmth. Two women of similar practical temperament, genuinely fond of one another's company, navigating the small accumulated challenges of managing a household on a careful budget while maintaining, throughout, the outward appearance of effortless respectability that Victorian convention demanded of women in their respective positions. I find something worth noting in how these various households, so different in their formal social standing, nonetheless shared, underneath all their distinguishing particulars, a fundamentally similar daily texture, meals to prepare, children to raise, household budgets to carefully manage, small private worries to carry quietly alongside whatever public face each family presented to the town. Class, in a place like Millbrook, shaped the specific contours of daily life considerably. The Marsh household's grander stone house, the vicar's particular social authority, the Hartleys' own steady tradesman's respectability, each carrying its own distinct weight and its own distinct constraint. And yet underneath all these real, meaningful differences, there remains something genuinely universal in how each of these families actually spent their ordinary evenings, gathered together in whatever warmth they had managed to build, weathering whatever small worries the day had brought, and simply patiently continuing. Let us return one final time to Thomas and Eleanor themselves, because their own quiet later years, I think, offer the most fitting close to everything we have spent this evening exploring together, a whole ordinary life, patiently accumulated, finally arriving at the particular contentment that only genuine, sustained years of careful living can actually produce. Grandchildren, over time, became a regular, genuinely delighted feature of the household's calendar, Alice's own 2 children making the journey from the county town perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, filling the house for the duration of their visits with exactly the particular noisy warmth that had once belonged to Alice and Robert's own childhood, and Eleanor found in these visits a very specific joy watching her grandchildren discover the same small household textures, the same creaking staircase, the same particular quality of light in the parlour window that had once shaped her own children's earliest years within these same walls. Robert's own children visited rather less frequently, given the greater distance involved, but his letters, faithfully continued across all these years, kept Eleanor and Thomas closely acquainted with his family's own gradual unfolding, and there was a particular satisfaction reading these accounts in recognizing in his descriptions of his own son's stubborn insistence on doing everything independently an unmistakable echo of Robert's own childhood temperament, the whole pattern repeating itself, gently, one generation folding into the next. Thomas eventually handed the shop over to Alfred, by this point a genuinely accomplished tradesman in his own right, married with a family of his own, and the transition, when it finally came, carried considerably more emotion than either man had quite anticipated, Thomas finding himself on his final morning behind the counter, lingering rather longer than strictly necessary over the small familiar rituals, the checking of stock, the careful arrangement of the window, before finally, with a gruffness that only barely disguised how genuinely moved he was, handing Alfred the shop keys and stepping back, for the first time in over 30 years, from the daily rhythm that had shaped nearly the entirety of his adult working life. Retirement, for a man of Thomas's particular temperament, might have proved difficult, had it not been for the particular richness of the life he and Eleanor had built together across all these years. A genuine, deep companionship that filled the newly available hours considerably more fully than either of them might have predicted. Long walks together along the river path that Sarah and Peter had once favoured for their own courtship, afternoons spent simply reading together in the parlour, the particular unhurried pleasure of 2 people who had spent decades building a life together finally having the time to properly, thoroughly enjoy it. I find something genuinely moving, thinking of this particular stretch of their story, in how completely it echoes everything we have already come to understand about this couple across this whole long evening together. The same patient, unhurried temperament that carried Thomas through decades of careful shopkeeping, the same quiet competence that carried Eleanor through decades of careful household management. Neither of them changed, fundamentally, by the passage of so many years, simply deepened the particular qualities that had always defined them, settling, gradually, into something even more essentially comfortably themselves. There is a particular kind of evening that belongs specifically to a marriage this long and this well tended, and I think it is worth describing properly before we finally let our whole story rest. Thomas and Eleanor, in these later years, developed a habit of sitting together on the small bench Thomas had built himself years earlier for the tiny garden behind the house, watching the light fade over Millbrook's familiar rooftops, saying very little, requiring very little, simply present together in the particular comfortable silence that only decades of genuine shared life can actually produce, the whole accumulated weight of everything they had built together, a shop, a household, two children successfully launched into their own separate, thriving lives, resting easily between them, unspoken and entirely, completely understood. Let us pause a while longer before we reach that final close, because there are still a few more corners of this story worth visiting properly, and I find myself, if I am honest, genuinely reluctant to hurry toward the end of it. Alice's own wedding, when it finally arrived, deserves a proper telling, because it offers us a chance to see a genuinely joyful Victorian family occasion in its full, careful detail, considerably removed from the more modest, practical rhythm of the household's ordinary days. The ceremony took place in the county town itself, at the church nearest the school where Alice had spent so many productive years, and Eleanor and Thomas made the journey together, along with a considerably grown Robert, home briefly from his own clerkship for the occasion, the whole family gathering in a town that had, over the years of Alice's residence there, become almost as familiar to them as Millbrook itself, through the accumulated weight of so many visits and so many detailed letters describing its particular streets and shops and the small daily texture of Alice's independent life. Eleanor's preparations for the day carried a particular intensity that surprised even her. A new dress commissioned specifically for the occasion, considerably finer than her usual practical wardrobe, in a deep blue that Thomas, drawing on decades of professional expertise, had helped her select from his own shop's finest available stock, and a new bonnet trimmed with ribbon that Alice herself, in a small charming detail that delighted the whole family, had actually helped select on a visit home some months earlier, without either of them realizing, at the time, that it was being chosen specifically for this particular occasion. The wedding breakfast, held afterward at a hotel near the church, brought together a genuinely wide circle of guests, Alice's colleagues from the school, Miss Pargeter herself offering a small, characteristically dry toast that nonetheless carried genuine warmth beneath its reserved delivery, several of Alice's former pupils, now grown considerably, attending with an evident affection that spoke to the genuine impact Alice had made across her years of teaching, and the groom's own family, respectable, warm, and evidently delighted to be welcoming Alice into their circle. I find something genuinely moving in watching Eleanor move through this particular day, a mother witnessing the full, complete flowering of a choice her daughter had made, quietly and with considerable courage, all those years earlier at a breakfast table in Millbrook, that small unanswered letter sitting in its writing box. Every guest at this wedding, every warm toast offered, every genuine expression of affection from Alice's colleagues and former pupils existed only because Alice had chosen, against the grain of what convention might have expected of her, to build a professional life first. And Eleanor, watching her daughter dance her first dance as a married woman with a husband who had, by every visible sign, genuinely come to admire and respect the considerable person Alice had become, felt a pride that ran considerably deeper than the ordinary pride any mother feels on her daughter's wedding day. Thomas, for his part, managed to make it through the entire ceremony and the greater portion of the breakfast afterward, with his composure largely intact, only finally losing the battle during the traditional father's toast, his voice catching noticeably on the final sentence, something about how proud his own father, a farm labourer who had never in his own lifetime imagined a granddaughter capable of building the kind of independent, respected life Alice had built, would have been to see this particular day, and the whole room, hearing it, understood exactly the weight behind those simple words. Harvest time, meanwhile, across all these years, brought its own particular seasonal celebration to Millbrook, and I want to spend a little proper time with it too, because Harvest Home, as it was generally called, represented one of the genuine high points of the town's agricultural calendar, a celebration considerably older in its roots than Christmas itself, marking the successful gathering in of the season's crops from the farms surrounding the town. The church itself was decorated for the occasion, with an abundance that stood in warm contrast to its more restrained everyday appearance. Sheaves of wheat arranged along the windowsills, baskets of apples and vegetables, and the season's final flowers filling every available surface, a genuine, tangible expression of gratitude for a successful year's growing season that every family in Millbrook, whether directly involved in farming or not, understood on some fundamental level to be connected to their own continued prosperity and well-being. A feast followed the harvest service, held on the common land where bonfire night celebrations were later staged each November, long trestle tables set up beneath the open sky if the weather cooperated, laden with the particular abundance the season's successful harvest had provided, and the whole town gathered together in a way that echoed, in its genuine cross-class participation, the fair's own festive democracy, farmers and tradesmen and their families sharing tables and conversation with a warmth that Millbrook's more ordinary weekday social divisions rarely permitted quite so openly. Eleanor, across all these years, found in Harvest Home a particular favourite among the town's yearly celebrations, something in its genuine, unpretentious gratitude appealing to her own steady, practical temperament, and she made a habit, every single year, of contributing her own careful preserves to the celebration's abundant table, jars of fruit put up earlier in the season, a small tangible contribution to the collective plenty that the whole gathered town was, on this particular afternoon each year, genuinely celebrating together. There is one more particular kind of day worth exploring before we finally let this story rest. A day considerably quieter than any we have described so far, and I think, given the hour, it might be exactly the right note to settle into as we approach our own close. A wet Sunday afternoon, the kind that arrived several times each autumn, when the weather turned genuinely unpleasant enough that even a walk seemed unwise, and the whole family found itself confined to the house for the better part of a day. And I want to describe this particular kind of afternoon slowly, because there is a specific comfort in it that I think translates rather well to exactly the state you are hopefully drifting toward right now. Rain against the parlour window, steady rather than dramatic, the particular grey light of an English autumn Sunday filtering through curtains that nobody has bothered drawing fully open, given how little brightness the day actually has to offer, the fire, lit rather earlier than usual, crackling steadily in the grate, its warmth the primary defence against a chill that has settled into the house alongside the rain. Eleanor, on an afternoon like this, generally settled into her needlework with a particular unhurried thoroughness that busier days rarely permitted, working through mending that had accumulated over a fuller week, her needle moving in its familiar steady rhythm, while rain traced its own steady rhythm against the glass beside her. Thomas, freed from the shop by Sunday's customary closing, occupied himself on afternoons like this with correspondence, letters to a cousin in the north, careful accounts kept up to date, or simply sat with a book, something he permitted himself considerably less often than Alice's more voracious reading habit, but that he genuinely enjoyed when the opportunity presented itself. A history of the county, perhaps, or an account of some distant part of the growing empire that satisfied his own quiet, largely unspoken curiosity about the wider world beyond Millbrook's familiar streets. The children, on afternoons like this, occupied themselves with whatever quiet indoor amusement the day permitted, Robert with a puzzle or a book of his own, Alice, in her turn, often at the piano, working through pieces with less pressure toward performance than her Wednesday evening sessions required, simply playing for her own pleasure, the sound drifting through the house alongside the steady rain, mingling with the fire's own quiet crackling into a particular layered warmth that I think anyone who has spent a rainy afternoon indoors in any century would recognize instantly. There is a particular quality of time on days like this that I find genuinely worth dwelling on, a slowness that felt, even to the people actually living inside it, distinctly different from their ordinary weekday pace. Nothing needed to be accomplished. No customer waited to be served. No post required answering. No washing demanded attention. Simply the house, and the rain, and the fire, and a family occupying the same warm rooms together with no particular obligation weighing on any of them beyond simply passing the afternoon pleasantly. Sarah, on these quieter Sunday afternoons, found her own duties considerably lighter than her usual weekday rhythm, the household's Sunday dinner having already been managed earlier, and she often used these unexpected pockets of quiet to sit for a while in the kitchen with whatever mending or correspondence of her own required attention, the same rain that kept the family confined to their parlour drumming steadily against the scullery window behind her, and there was, in these shared quiet afternoons, a particular parallel comfort between mistress and servant, each occupying her own portion of the same rain-sheltered house, each finding her own version of the same unhurried Sunday peace. Tea, on an afternoon like this, arrived a little earlier than usual and lingered rather longer, the family gathering around the parlour table with no particular hurry to disperse afterward, and I think there is something worth noting in how completely this kind of unremarkable, weather-confined afternoon actually represented one of the household's genuine small luxuries, an entire day with nothing demanded of anyone beyond simply existing together, warm and dry, while the rain continued its steady work outside. As the light finally began fading toward evening, considerably earlier than a clear day would have permitted, Eleanor would light the lamps a little sooner than usual, and the family's ordinary evening routine would begin, folding this particular quiet, rain-confined day gently into the same familiar rhythm that closed every other evening we have spent together tonight: supper, a little reading, the children's bedtime, and finally Thomas and Eleanor's own quiet retirement, the rain, by this point, often softening into the kind of gentle, steady patter that made sleep, on nights like this, come considerably more easily than usual, the whole house settling into rest, accompanied by that same soft, continuous sound against every window, a lullaby the weather itself seemed to be offering, entirely by accident, to everyone sheltering safely beneath that particular roof. I mention this particular kind of day specifically because I think it offers, perhaps better than any of the more eventful days we have spent together tonight, the truest possible picture of what made this family's ordinary life genuinely worth living. Not the celebrations, not the departures and arrivals, meaningful as all of those genuinely were, but this, simply this, a warm house, a steady rain, a family gathered together with nothing particular required of any of them, content simply to exist quietly in one another's company until the day, gently and without any fuss at all, came to its natural close. Let me tell you a little more, too, about Eleanor's charitable work, the scheme she took up in her quieter later years, providing warm clothing to Millbrook's poorer families, because I think it deserves a fuller telling than I gave it earlier, and it offers a genuinely warm final glimpse of who Eleanor Hartley had become across this whole long story. The scheme itself operated with a particular practical simplicity. A small committee of church women, Eleanor and Mrs. Ainsworth among its most dedicated members, meeting monthly through the autumn to organize the collection and distribution of warm garments, some purchased with funds raised through small parish events, others made by the women themselves through long companionable afternoons of collective sewing, the church hall filled, on these particular afternoons, with a genuinely pleasant industry, needles moving steadily, conversation flowing easily among women who had, over years of this same shared work, become genuinely close. Eleanor brought to this work exactly the same careful competence that had once run her own household, an instinctive sense of which families genuinely needed assistance and which merely wanted it, gathered through her own years of careful attention to the town's various households and a particular gentleness in how the assistance was actually delivered, never as charity dispensed from a position of superiority, but as a neighbour's practical kindness, offered with a discretion that spared recipients any unnecessary embarrassment. There was a particular family, a widow named Mrs. Coombs with 3 children, living in one of the more modest cottages at the edge of town, whom Eleanor visited personally each winter with a small parcel of warm clothing, and the friendship that gradually developed between the two women, so different in their material circumstances, carried a genuine warmth that neither had particularly anticipated when Eleanor first knocked on that cottage door some years earlier. Mrs. Coombs's own eldest daughter, in fact, eventually found a position in service through Eleanor's own quiet recommendation to a family of her acquaintance in the county town, a small practical kindness that changed the whole trajectory of that particular young woman's prospects considerably for the better. I find something genuinely moving in watching this particular thread of Eleanor's story unfold, because it shows us a woman who had spent her whole adult life managing her own household's careful, patient prosperity, finally turning that same considerable competence outward toward the wider community that had, across all these years, shaped and supported her own family's steady rise. There is a kind of quiet completion in it, Eleanor extending to other families exactly the kind of careful, practical care she had always extended to her own, understanding, I think, on some fundamental level, that the particular good fortune her own household had enjoyed across this whole story was never entirely separate from the wider community that had made it possible. The town's elementary school, meanwhile, established some years into our story following the wider educational reforms that gradually extended basic schooling to working-class children across the country, became another quiet focus of Eleanor's attention, and she took a particular pleasure each summer in the school's annual treat, a genuinely joyful occasion held on the same common land that hosted Harvest Home and Bonfire Night. The town's working-class children, considerably less accustomed to festive abundance than families like the Hartleys, gathered together for an afternoon of games and a proper tea, sandwiches and cake provided through the same collective parish generosity that funded Eleanor's winter clothing scheme. Eleanor helped organise this particular event for several consecutive years, and there was, watching children who had considerably less material comfort than her own grandchildren enjoying a genuinely carefree summer afternoon, races run across the common's grass, a proper tea laid out on trestle tables, a particular satisfaction that ran considerably deeper than mere charitable obligation. She found herself, more than once across these afternoons, thinking of Sarah's own childhood, of the particular gulf in circumstance that had always separated Eleanor's own family from families like these, and finding in this small yearly event a genuine, if modest, way of narrowing that gulf, however briefly, however incompletely, for one warm summer afternoon each year. I want to close this particular thread by noting something that I think captures, better than almost anything else in this whole evening's story, the essential character Eleanor Hartley had developed across her many years, from that young bride lacing her own corset alone in grey morning light at the very start of our story, to this considerably older woman, organising warm clothing for families she had never previously known, delighting in children who were not her own at a summer treat she had helped arrange. The same careful, patient competence that once managed a modest tradesman's household had grown, gradually and almost without her noticing, into something considerably larger, a genuine practical goodness extended outward into her whole community, and I think there is something worth genuinely admiring in watching an ordinary life, lived with sufficient care and attention across enough years, gradually accumulate into something quietly, unmistakably good. There is one final occasion I want to describe before we let this story properly rest, because it brings together nearly every thread we have followed tonight, and I think it offers exactly the right closing warmth for where we are headed. Thomas and Eleanor's silver wedding anniversary arrived some years into the story's later chapters, and the family, without either of them quite realizing what was being arranged, gathered a genuinely full celebration around it, Alice and her husband and children making the journey from the county town, Robert managing, with some difficulty given the distance involved, to bring his own family for the occasion as well, and Sarah, now firmly established as a genuine family friend rather than merely a former servant, arriving with Peter and their own grown children to help mark the day properly. The celebration itself unfolded at the house, the parlour and the small garden behind it, both pressed into service for an occasion considerably larger than either space was strictly designed to accommodate, and I want you to picture it properly because there is a particular richness in this scene worth lingering over. Bunting, modest but cheerful, strung between the garden's two apple trees, a table laid with a genuinely impressive spread that Eleanor, and in a lovely small continuity, Sarah, had spent the preceding 2 days preparing together in the same kitchen where Sarah had once, so many years earlier, learned every particular rhythm of this household's domestic life. Thomas, presented that afternoon with a small silver frame containing a photograph of the whole assembled family, found himself, for perhaps the second time in this entire story, genuinely unable to maintain his usual careful composure, and Eleanor, watching her husband's evident emotion, found her own eyes considerably brighter than the occasion's cheerful atmosphere might have predicted. There was music that afternoon, Alice at a borrowed piano brought specially into the garden for the occasion, playing the same familiar Wednesday evening repertoire that had once filled the parlour across so many ordinary evenings, and the whole gathered family, 3 generations now properly represented, sang along with considerably more enthusiasm than precision, Thomas's own singing voice, still cheerfully inaccurate after all these years, drawing exactly the same fond amusement it always had. Robert's own eldest son, by this point old enough to have developed real opinions about nearly everything, spent a considerable portion of the afternoon deep in conversation with his grandfather about the shop, now Alfred's own thriving concern, and Thomas found himself explaining the particular careful patience good business required to a grandson genuinely curious about it, experiencing something close to the same quiet satisfaction he had once felt training Alfred himself, this same accumulated wisdom finding, yet again, a fresh pair of ears willing to properly receive it. As the afternoon gradually eased toward evening, the gathered family settled into a more relaxed, scattered arrangement, small clusters of conversation forming and reforming across the garden and the parlour both, children moving freely between the adults' various conversations, and Eleanor found herself at one point simply standing quietly at the edge of it all, watching this whole gathered assembly of people her own life had, across 25 years, somehow managed to produce. I want you to sit with this image for a moment, because I think it captures, more completely than any single scene we have described tonight, the full accumulated result of everything this story has followed. A young bride, lacing her own corset alone in grey morning light on an ordinary Tuesday all those years ago, had become, across a quarter-century of patient, careful, largely unremarkable daily living, the centre of this whole warm, considerable gathering, children and grandchildren and dear friends who had once been merely a young servant girl lighting a cold kitchen range before dawn, all of them here, together, in this same garden, on this particular golden autumn afternoon, because of choices made and sustained, day after ordinary day, across every single one of the years this story has followed. Thomas found her there, at the garden's edge, and came to stand beside her without saying anything at first, the two of them simply watching their whole gathered family together for a long, quiet moment. 25 years, Thomas said eventually, and there was a particular wonder in his voice that Eleanor recognized immediately, because she felt exactly the same wonder herself. 25 years, she agreed, and reached for his hand, the same small gesture he had offered her at the close of so many ordinary evenings across this whole long story, and the two of them stood there together a while longer, watching the light fade gently over their garden, their family, their whole accumulated life, entirely content, in this particular golden moment, to simply let it all wash over them, exactly as it was. The celebration wound down eventually, as every celebration must, guests departing gradually through the early evening, warm farewells exchanged, promises made to gather again soon, and by the time the house finally settled back into its own ordinary quiet, considerably later than its usual evening hour, Thomas and Eleanor found themselves at last, alone together in the same parlour where we first properly met them, the same chairs, the same fire, the same accumulated warmth of a life well and thoroughly lived, 25 years deep now, and counting. Let me offer you one more small detail before we finally close, because I think it deserves a place in this story, and it touches on something we have not yet properly explored, the particular texture of Millbrook's small reading room, established some years into our story through the combined efforts of several of the town's more literary-minded residents, Mr. Ainsworth the vicar prominent among them, housed in a modest room above the stationer's shop, the same building where Mrs. Prentice kept her own rooms. The reading room offered access to newspapers from across the country, a modest but genuinely well-chosen collection of books, considerably broader than the subscription library's more popular novels, and a warm, quiet space where a certain kind of Millbrook resident, tradesmen and clerks, and the occasional more studious farmer's son, could spend an evening hour or two in genuine, unhurried intellectual pursuit. Thomas became, over the years, a regular, if not especially frequent visitor, drawn particularly by the room's selection of newspapers from London and beyond, and he found in these evening visits a particular pleasure considerably different from his usual parlour reading, the specific companionable quiet of several men, none of them close friends exactly, simply sharing a warm room and a mutual appreciation for careful, considered reading, occasional low conversation drifting between them about whatever significant news the day's papers had brought. Robert, too, in his final years before departing for his clerkship, discovered in the reading room a genuine intellectual awakening that his more mechanical grammar school lessons had never quite managed to produce, spending several evenings a week working through histories and accounts of distant travel that fed a genuine curiosity about the wider world his own eventual clerkship, however respectable, would never fully satisfy, and Thomas, noticing his son's evident engagement, found himself quietly, privately proud of this particular development, understanding it as evidence of exactly the kind of thoughtful, engaged character he had always hoped his son might grow into. I mention this small institution specifically because I think it captures something worth holding on to about this whole particular period of English life, this quiet, largely unremarked flourishing of ordinary intellectual curiosity among people who possessed neither great wealth nor formal higher education, tradesmen and clerks gathering in a modest room above a stationer's shop simply because they wanted, genuinely, to understand the wider world a little better, and found, in this small collective effort, exactly the means to do so. The reading room closed its doors each evening at 9, and Thomas, on the evenings he attended, made his way home afterward along the same familiar high street he had walked every single day of this entire story, past the darkened shop windows, past the church rising quiet and solid against the night sky, past Dr. Marsh's solid stone house and the vicarage and Mrs. Fenwick's brick-fronted home with its carefully tended garden. The whole town settled now into its own particular nighttime quiet, and there was, in these solitary evening walks home, a particular contentment Thomas came to genuinely treasure, this small quiet hour entirely his own, moving through a town he had spent his whole adult life helping to build and sustain, toward a house where Eleanor would be waiting, the lamp still lit, ready to hear whatever small news the evening's reading had brought him. One more small thread deserves mention before we finally rest, the particular fate of Thomas's own bow window, which he continued dressing every single Monday morning for as long as he kept the shop, and which Alfred, upon taking over, maintained with exactly the same careful weekly ritual, understanding, without ever needing to be told directly, precisely how much quiet pride Thomas had always invested in that small, unremarkable weekly task. Visitors to Millbrook in these later years, passing along the high street on market day or any ordinary Tuesday afternoon, would have seen in that same bow window Thomas first dressed as a young apprentice's employer decades earlier, a display considerably updated in its particular fashions but recognizably essentially the same careful, patient arrangement of fabric and color and light that had always defined it, a small continuous thread of craft and attention running unbroken through every single year this story has followed, proof in its own quiet way that some things, tended properly and passed carefully from one pair of hands to the next, simply endure. And Millbrook itself, this whole small imagined town we have spent so many hours inside tonight, continued on exactly as towns like it always have, market days following market days, seasons folding steadily into seasons, each household within it carrying its own version of exactly the story we have just followed. Ordinary joys and ordinary worries, patiently, faithfully tended, decade after decade, long after the particular family we chose to follow tonight had, each in their own turn, finally laid their own accumulated years quietly to rest. I think, before we let the candle finally go out, it is worth remembering that Millbrook itself never existed exactly as I have described it tonight, not on any actual map, not in any actual county record. It is instead a careful composite built from the genuine, well-documented texture of countless real English market towns across this particular century, the real rhythm of real shops and real households and real small kindnesses, gathered together and given for the span of this one evening, a single name and a single family to follow, everything in it, the laundry days and the market stalls, the careful class distinctions and the quiet persistent warmth that so often crossed them anyway, was genuinely, faithfully true of ordinary English life in this period, even if the particular Hartleys, the particular Sarah and Peter, the particular pocket watch wound faithfully every single night, belong entirely to the story we have told together tonight, and to nowhere else. There is one small object I want to return to before we close, because it has been sitting quietly at the edges of this whole story since its very first pages, and I think it deserves, finally, its own proper attention. Thomas's pocket watch, the plain silver piece that belonged to his own father, and that he wound every single night without exception across the entire span of years we have just spent together, carries within its small, unremarkable mechanism something worth sitting with for a moment. It measured, faithfully, every single one of those mornings we described, Sarah's dawn rising, breakfast punctual beginning, the shop's careful daily opening, and it measured, too, every evening, every winding ritual performed at the close of every single day this story has touched, a small constant mechanical heartbeat running quietly underneath the whole accumulated span of this family's life. Thomas eventually passed the watch to Robert on the occasion of Robert's own eldest son's birth, a small quiet ceremony conducted with exactly the understated gruffness that characterized nearly every genuinely emotional moment in this particular family's history, and Robert, accepting it, understood precisely what was actually being handed to him, not merely a functioning timepiece but the whole accumulated weight of everything that Watch had witnessed. Generations of careful, patient, ordinary living, now passed forward into hands that would, in their own turn, measure out their own accumulated span of ordinary days. I find something genuinely worth holding onto in this small detail, because I think it captures something true about what actually endures across the long accumulated span of any family's history. Not grand achievements necessarily, though this family achieved a great deal, considered properly. Not dramatic turning points, though there were a few of those too. A letter finally answered, a coach pulling away down a January road, a proposal offered on a familiar riverside path. What actually endures, watching a family's story unfold across enough years, is this steady, patient, largely unremarkable accumulation of ordinary care, wound faithfully every single evening, passed forward, generation after generation, into whatever hands are ready to receive it. And now, I think, it is time to let this particular evening and this particular story finally come to rest. We have spent a long while together tonight in Millbrook, watching an ordinary family move through an ordinary span of years, dressing and undressing, opening shops and closing them, writing letters and finally receiving the replies they had been quietly hoping for, walking familiar riverside paths, raising children, and eventually, gently, releasing them into their own separate lives. There was no great drama in any of it, not really, no dramatic villain, no sudden catastrophe requiring rescue, simply the patient, accumulated texture of people caring for one another, day after day, across decades, in a small English town that no history book will ever specifically name, and that mattered, nonetheless, enormously to every single person who called it home. I hope, wherever you are listening from tonight, in whatever quiet room this story has found you in, that something in it has settled you the way I intended it to. Perhaps you recognize something of your own household in the Hartleys' particular rhythm, the shared evening meal, the small private hopes carried quietly across a breakfast table, the particular comfort of a familiar chair beside a familiar fire. Perhaps you found comfort simply in the steady, unhurried pace of it, a whole evening spent somewhere entirely removed from your own particular worries, in a town that exists now only in imagination and careful historical reconstruction, and yet feels, I hope, genuinely real to you nonetheless. Let your own breathing settle now, the way it has been gradually settling this whole while, whether you have noticed it or not. Let your shoulders release whatever tension they have been quietly holding. The blanket is still there, pulled up around you, exactly as it was at the start of our story together. The room around you is dark and warm and entirely, completely safe. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing else you need to do except simply rest. Somewhere, in the particular quiet imagined dark of Millbrook, Thomas is winding his watch one final time. Eleanor is taking down her hair with the same steady, unhurried strokes she has used every single night of this entire story. The candle, in a moment, will go out, and the house, room by room, will settle into that same particular comfortable silence that has closed every single evening we have spent together tonight. A dog barking once, somewhere distant, and then falling quiet, the whole small town easing itself, gently and completely, towards sleep. Let it carry you there too. Rest well.